Before we begin tonight's quiet journey into the Shang Dynasty, I just want to say thank you for being here. If you enjoy these calm, simple history stories and want more bedtime documentaries like this one, feel free to tap the like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets me keep making peaceful videos for you to fall asleep to. Alright, settle in, get comfortable, and let's drift back into ancient China together. Long before bronze gleamed in royal hands or kings carved their questions into heated bones, China was a quiet world wrapped in mist. The mornings were soft and pale, like the sky was still waking up. The yellow river drifted through the land with a slow, sleepy confidence, though everyone knew it had a wild temper tucked behind that calm face. Villages were small and simple back then, clusters of huts shaped from mud, straw, and hope. Life moved at a gentle pace. People woke with the sun, yawned with the cows, and tried their best not to get washed away by surprise floods. It was a world not yet ruled by dynasties, but by weather, soil, and patience. And honestly, the land seemed to be waiting for something big, something organized, something dynasty-shaped to finally happen. The first people who shaped this land were not kings or warriors. They were farmers with sore backs and very stubborn determination. Cultures like Longshan rose in the east, building communities where pottery wasn't just pottery, it was pride. They carved jade too, shaping it into ornaments that glowed like frozen moonlight. These folks knew beauty even when life was mostly dirt and grain. Farming tools improved bit by bit. Someone figured out how to make a better hoe, someone else discovered a smarter way to store millet so rats wouldn't treat it like a buffet. Slowly, these villages grew into little networks, each one humming with life, gossip, and the occasional argument over who forgot to shut the goat pen last night. The land was peaceful, most days, but the yellow river had a personality. One moment it was calm, like a lazy dragon taking a nap. The next, it rose up and swept through the plains with the attitude of "I'm just going to move this whole village a few miles to the left, don't mind me." Because of that, communities learned to adapt. They built homes where the soil was rich but high enough to avoid disaster. Well, usually. Social roles slowly appeared too. Some people became leaders, others became the experts on farming, fishing, or how to not drown when the river gets cranky. Even without writing or kings, you could see the early shape of society forming. It wasn't a dynasty yet, but it was quietly working toward one, the way a seed quietly becomes a forest. As the centuries wandered along, new cultures kept rising like soft waves on the shore. One of them was the Erlito culture, which sat somewhere between myth and history like a shy teenager who didn't want to fully introduce itself. The people of Erlito built larger settlements than the ones before them. Their houses were bigger, their tools sharper, and their pottery, honestly, it was getting pretty fancy. You could almost see the early sparkle of what a real kingdom might look like. These folks experimented with early bronze too, not the mighty Shang bronze we love to brag about later, but the baby steps, the first tries, the metal lumps that said, "Look, we're getting there." And that alone was huge. Bronze meant power, but also organization. If you're melting metal, you're doing more than surviving, you're planning for the future. Daily life during this time wasn't glamorous, but it was full of meaning. People woke up early, stretched their backs, probably with a groan, and headed to the fields. Millet, wheat, rice, these crops were the heartbeat of every village. A good harvest meant smiles, full bellies, and maybe even a tiny festival. A bad harvest meant everyone politely pretending not to panic while staring at the sky like, "Hey clouds, this would be a great time for rain, don't be shy." People cooked simple meals in clay pots, traded goods with neighbors, and told stories around warm night fires. Most of these stories were about spirits, animals, or why the river behaved like it had personal issues. Without writing, memories lived in people's mouths. Tradition flowed from parent to child, like a whispered secret. As villages grew into clusters and clusters grew into early towns, something interesting began to happen: social hierarchy. Nothing dramatic at first. No golden crowns or royal palaces yet, but you started seeing hints. Certain families held more farmland, certain elders made bigger decisions, some people maintained the tools, some oversaw the animals, and some were surprisingly good at telling everyone else what to do. Even trade routes started to form. Jade from one region ended up hundreds of miles away. Pottery styles spread like fashion trends. One day everyone had round pots, the next day they all wanted tall ones. And little by little the land developed a rhythm, a quiet, organized beat. It wasn't a kingdom yet, but you could feel the idea warming up in the air, stretching its arms, preparing to take shape. Even though life was simple, the land itself shaped the destiny of the people living on it. The Yellow River, often called China's sorrow, could flip from gentle stream to raging monster faster than anyone liked. Every time it flooded, it dropped layers of rich silt across the plains. Great for future farming, terrible for anyone who just wanted a quiet afternoon without swimming for their life. But this strange relationship with nature did something important. It taught people to adapt, to build smarter, to work together. You can't survive a stubborn river alone, so families dug ditches, built dikes, and learned the patterns of the seasons. They watched the sky like it was a giant mood ring. Thunder meant move your stuff uphill. Sudden heat meant brace yourself. This constant dance between humans and nature slowly pushed communities to become more organized, more cooperative, and honestly, more determined than ever not to get washed downstream again. With so much shared labor, early China wasn't just a place of farms and tools, it was a place of growing identity. People gathered for planting, harvesting, cooking, weaving and shaping pottery. They shared stories about their ancestors, about mysterious spirits in the forests, and about the river dragons that supposedly lived beneath the Yellow River. Kids probably ran around barefoot, chasing chickens or pretending to hunt imaginary beasts. Elders sat under trees, carving bone or smoothing jade, their hands slow and steady. And little by little these traditions formed a kind of early cultural glue. Nothing written yet, just memories held tightly in people's minds. But you could feel something big coming, a shift, a need for order and records, a whisper of a future where someone might finally say, hey, maybe we should write this stuff down. The land was brewing a dynasty, even before people understood what a dynasty was. As centuries passed, these early cultures didn't stay frozen in time. They kept growing, stretching and shifting like slow-moving clouds across the plains. Villages turned into towns. Towns turned into early centers of craft and trade. And signs of real leadership started to show. Maybe it began with the person who was the best at predicting floods, or the one who knew how to store grain so it didn't become rodent lunch, or the elder who could calm everyone down when the river threw another tantrum. Bit by bit, leaders gained respect, and respect slowly became authority. Not the loud kind, but the practical kind, the kind built on survival. And with authority came the first hints of organized rule. You could feel the land slipping towards something bigger, a system, a structure, a world where power wasn't just about strength or age, but about who could bring order to the chaos. The earth beneath these people's feet felt like it was preparing for its first dynasty, even if nobody had the vocabulary for it yet. So by the time the world was ready for the Shang people to appear, the land was no longer a blank canvas. It was a place shaped by centuries of quiet effort, by farmers who listened to the soil, by potters shaping vessels that outlived them, by jade carvers who treated stone like something spiritual, and by whole communities who survived the moods of the Yellow River. All these small steps built the foundation of early Chinese civilization, a foundation strong enough to hold a future filled with kings, ancestors, bronze weapons, chariots, rituals, and yes, the first written words. The rise of the Shang would not come out of nowhere. It grew from this slow, patient world, a world that had been waiting, preparing, practicing, a world that didn't yet know that writing would soon crack across bone and shell like lightning in the dark. But the moment was coming. History was gathering itself, taking a long breath. The Shang were near. History loves mystery, and the early Shang people arrived wrapped in it like a fog rolling across the plains. They didn't burst onto the scene with drums and trumpets. They rose slowly, quietly, like a campfire growing from a spark. Before they became rulers, they were just another clan among many, wandering through valleys, farming little patches of land, and trying not to annoy the river gods too much. But something about this clan was different. They were organized, focused. They had leaders who could actually make decisions without arguing for 3 days straight. Bit by bit, the Shang gathered followers, land, and influence. They weren't kings yet, more like strong community bosses, but the energy was there. The kind that makes you squint at them and think, these people might be going places. A lot of old texts talk about a legendary figure named Cheng Tang, the man who would one day bring down the Shah and stand at the front of the Shang dynasty. But before he became a legend, imagine him as a young leader trying to hold his growing clan together. He probably walked through makeshift camps, checking on farmers, warriors, herders, and the occasional person who insisted the spirits had spoken to them through a rock. Life was busy, messy, and alive. And while most clans were just trying to get through the week, the Shang began forming clear roles: leaders, warriors, craftsmen, farmers. They started looking less like a wandering group and more like the early skeleton of a state. And even though no one had writing yet to document the moment, the feeling must have been clear: something was shifting. The rise of the Shang wasn't sudden, it was a careful dance across generations. Each leader added something new. One expanded farming lands, another built stronger shelters, another trained warriors to guard the clan from rival groups who were also eyeing those fertile plains. And through all this, the Shang learned how to weave alliances. They traded goods, shared rituals, married into neighboring tribes, and slowly pulled more people into their orbit. If this were a bedtime soap opera, this is the part where every elder in China is whispering, "Have you heard what the Shang clan is up to?" They're getting powerful. The land itself seemed to sense the shift. The fields stretched wider, tools grew sharper, bronze experiments became more common. Everything was warming toward a future dynasty, one that would leave marks carved into bone and history itself. As the Shang clan grew stronger, other groups started paying attention. Some were curious, some were nervous, some were probably thinking, oh great, here comes another powerful neighbor, we barely survived the last one. But the Shang didn't grow by crushing everyone they met. They grew by weaving themselves into the landscape like threads in a giant tapestry. They settled in fertile valleys where the soil felt soft under bare feet, where rivers curved gently through the land, and where forests offered shade, wood, and the occasional wild animal that wandered too close to the cooking fire. Their settlements expanded with straight paths, shared courtyards, and little workshops where craftsmen hammered away at stone or bone. Bit by bit, these places began to look like early towns, organized, busy, and full of life. The Shang didn't just survive, they planned, but the Shang didn't rise in a peaceful bubble. Rival clans were everywhere, each one wanting control of the best farmland or the safest riverbank. Sometimes these disagreements were solved with handshakes and trade. Other times, well, let's just say early warriors didn't sharpen their spears for decoration. Still, the Shang had something special: strategy. They chose their battles wisely. They avoided fights they didn't need. They kept alliances warm like a pot simmering over a fire. And when they did fight, they fought with precision, using early bronze tools that gave them an edge. You can imagine Shang warriors standing in tall grass at dawn, gripping bronze blades that glinted in the light. Not kings yet, not empire builders, but definitely not a clan you'd want to annoy before breakfast. All this growth, farming, trading, alliances, battles, needed something that earlier groups barely had: organization. Leaders had to manage fields, food, travel routes, and labor. Craftsmen needed materials delivered on time. Farmers needed to know when to plant and harvest. Hunters had to protect livestock. And everyone needed someone to blame when things went wrong. Slowly, a small ruling class took shape. People who weren't just strong, but also smart, patient, and annoyingly good at telling others what to do. These early Shang leaders became the backbone of the emerging dynasty. They planned irrigation channels. They organized building projects. They oversaw rituals to please the spirits. And with each new responsibility, they moved one step closer to becoming true kings. It's funny, no one realized it yet, but they were building the foundation for one of the greatest civilizations on Earth, one well on its way to carving its questions right into bone. With each generation, the Shang didn't just grow, they tightened. Their identity became clearer, their traditions sharper, their purpose stronger. Families who joined them took on Shang customs. Farmers worked fields owned by Shang leaders. Hunters protected Shang borders. Craftsmen followed Shang designs. And slowly the clan stopped feeling like a loose group of related families and started feeling like a nation in progress. You could hear it in the way people spoke. You could see it in the way they built their homes, bigger, sturdier, more confident. Even their fires burned brighter at night, lighting up the valley like tiny suns. And somewhere inside this growing world, the idea of kingship, true kingship, began to flicker to life. A leader wasn't just someone who solved problems anymore. He was someone who carried destiny, someone who looked at the land and thought, yes, this could all belong to us. And then came the whispers. Soft at first, like wind moving through tall grass. People spoke of leaders among the Shang, who were not just strong but blessed. Leaders who could read the seasons, predict storms, calm arguments, and guide the clan through danger. Leaders who might be chosen by the spirits. Whether these stories were entirely true or just the result of good PR, they worked. The Shang gained followers faster. Their name traveled farther. Their influence spread like dye soaking into cloth. And somewhere along the line, fate placed a child named Cheng Tang into this rising world. He would one day challenge the Shah, reshape the land, and begin a dynasty. But right now, in this early moment, the Shang clan was simply becoming something new, something powerful. The land felt it. Neighboring tribes felt it. Even the Yellow River, moody as it was, seemed to pause and pay attention. Change was coming, and it had the Shang's footsteps all over it. As the Shang spread across the landscape, their influence began weaving into every corner of life. Markets grew busier. Fields stretched wider across the plains, waving like green seas when the wind passed through. Hunt parties returned not just with food, but with stories of rival clans who were starting to step back, watching the Shang with wary eyes. Even craftsmen felt the shift. Their tools grew more refined. Their workshops hummed like beehives. Bronze, once a rare experiment, began to appear more often, shining in sunlight like tiny promises of the future. Everything pointed toward a world preparing for something bigger. The Shang weren't just another clan anymore. They were a rising force, the kind that made you straighten your posture a little when you said their name. A dynasty wasn't born yet, but the blueprint was already on the table. Looking back, it feels almost obvious that the Shang were on their way to greatness. But to the people living it day by day, it was probably just life. Busy, tiring, hopeful life. The seasons kept changing, children kept growing, leaders kept planning. And through all of this, the Shang slowly shaped a world sturdy enough to hold their future dynasty. When Cheng Tang finally stepped forward to challenge the Shang, he didn't rise from nothing. He rose from centuries of effort, survival,
and quiet ambition. The land had prepared him, the culture had shaped him, the people had carried him, and somewhere deep inside this growing kingdom, the first roots of writing, divination, and royal power were already taking hold. The Shang were about to step out of the mist and into history, but for now, they stood on the edge of it, calm and ready.
When the Shang finally began settling into real cities, the world around them changed like a quiet sunrise turning into full daylight. Gone were the days of small clusters of huts and wandering camps. Now the clan arrived at places that felt permanent, places where they could build bigger homes, dig deeper foundations and say, yes, this spot feels like home, unless the river floods again. These early capitals didn't look like the giant stone cities we imagine today. They were more like organized villages with ambition. Packed earth walls rose around them thick enough to make enemies think twice. Inside, homes stood in neat rows, and workshop fires glowed day and night. It was a new kind of life, structured, humming, and full of movement. For the first time, the Shang lived in a world that felt like it belonged to a rising kingdom, not just a strong clan. At the heart of these new settlements stood something truly magical for the time: bronze workshops. If you stood near one, the first thing you'd notice was the heat, the kind that wraps around you like a stubborn blanket you can't shake off. Inside, Shang metal workers worked like giants who knew secrets no one else did. They melted copper and tin, pouring glowing metal into clay molds shaped by steady hands. When the bronze cooled, the workers cracked the molds open to reveal tools, blades, vessels, and ornaments that shimmered in the light. Bronze wasn't just metal, it was power. It made stronger weapons, sturdier tools, and fancier ritual bowls that told everyone, yes, we are important now. You could almost hear the kingdom forming with each strike of the hammer. The sound echoed across the settlement like a heartbeat, but bronze wasn't the only sign that the Shang were leveling up. Their cities were planned with actual purpose. Roads connected the center of town to the workshops, to the farmland, and to the ritual spaces where leaders met with priests. Storage buildings, big ones, held grain like treasure. People no longer lived only for today, they were planning for seasons, for years. That kind of thinking doesn't show up unless a society is preparing for something big. There were also new kinds of workers, managers who oversaw food stores, guards who watched entrances, and officials who tried very hard to look serious even when fixing small problems like someone stealing extra millet. In this early capital, life felt organized for the first time, and that organization was the soil where future kingship would grow strong enough to change history. If you walked through a Shang capital during this time, you'd hear life buzzing from every direction. The streets weren't loud like modern cities, but they carried a steady hum, footsteps in packed dirt, the thump of grain bags being dropped, the clink of bronze tools in workshops, and the low chatter of people bargaining for everything from fresh vegetables to carved bone needles. The air was filled with smells too, smoke from furnaces, the warmth of cooked millet, and sometimes the not-so-charming scent of livestock wandering a little too freely. But it was all part of the rhythm. Everything felt purposeful. Even the small stalls where people traded pottery shapes or jade ornaments had an energy that said, this place matters. The Shang capital wasn't just a settlement, it was becoming a center of life, a heartbeat that pulled people in. One of the most impressive sights in a Shang capital was the ritual precinct, a space where priests, leaders, and specialists performed ceremonies for ancestors and spirits. This wasn't a quiet corner of town, it was the spiritual engine of the whole society. Here the Shang built altars, prepared offerings, and led rituals that connected the living with the dead. People believed their ancestors could guide them, warn them, or cheer them on, kind of like celestial family members watching over everything, except they required much more ceremony and a lot more incense. The ritual areas were filled with carved bones, jade tokens, bronze vessels, and the deep smell of burning herbs. Everything felt charged, almost electric. You could feel the future kingship forming in these spaces. Power wasn't just political, it was spiritual, woven into the idea that the Shang were chosen for something greater. But even with all this structure and ceremony, a Shang capital still felt human. Children played near the houses, chasing each other between weaving baskets and clay jars. Dogs and goats wandered around looking for snacks, even though everyone told them no about 20 times a day. Traders carried heavy loads on their backs, sometimes muttering about how grain seemed to weigh more every year. Workers in workshops wiped sweat from their foreheads and joked with each other about who had the hottest furnace. Life was ordinary, but also extraordinary, because every small action, every tool, every road, every ritual was building toward the identity of a real kingdom. A Shang capital didn't look like the giant cities of later China, but it carried the same spirit, organized life, shared purpose, and ambition that stretched beyond the horizon. As the Shang capital grew, the leadership needed a place that felt worthy of their power, so they built palace zones, not huge stone palaces like later dynasties, but large raised platforms made from packed earth. These platforms held long wooden halls where rulers met with advisors, planned battles, blessed harvests, and probably argued about who forgot to prepare the ritual offerings. The halls were grand in their own way, wide rooms with tall wooden beams, decorated with carved bones, painted pottery, and jade ornaments that caught light in a soft green glow. When the ruler walked through these halls, people stepped aside with quiet respect. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was the early heartbeat of royal authority. You could almost sense the future emperors hiding in the shadows of these humble structures. Nearby, another important space grew, the industrial district, where the sounds of bronze casting never seemed to rest. Here the air was thick with heat and smoke. Workers sweated as they lifted heavy molds, hammered fresh bronze, and shaped tools so sharp they could split a branch with one strike. If you watched long enough, you'd see the rhythm of their work: pour, cool, break the mold, polish, repeat. Sparks floated through the air like tiny fireflies, and the glow of furnaces lit up the workers' faces with warm orange light. The whole area had a kind of magic to it. Not mystical magic, more like the magic of human effort, the kind that builds a civilization piece by piece. The Shang didn't rise because of luck, they rose because places like this made them unstoppable. As day turned to evening, the Shang capital shifted into a calmer mood. The glow of furnaces dimmed, workers packed away tools, children drifted home, still laughing from games that had lasted hours. The streets, once filled with dust and movement, now felt softer. Smoke from cooking fires curled into the sky, mixing with fading light. Families gathered in small clusters, steaming bowls in hand, sharing news from the fields or workshops. Even the livestock settled down, probably dreaming about stealing food tomorrow. From the raised palace platforms to the humble homes near the walls, the whole capital breathed in a slow, steady rhythm. And in that peaceful moment, it was easy to see what this place truly was: the early shape of a kingdom. A home for leaders who would one day rule through bronze, wisdom, and the first written words. A city that carried the quiet echo of the future. Night in the Shang capital had its own kind of magic. Torches flickered along the main paths, casting long shadows across the ground. From the ritual precinct came soft chanting, a steady hum as priests sent prayers toward the ancestors. The palace zone glowed faintly, lanterns swaying gently in the breeze. Somewhere far off, a metalworker probably muttered, "Just one more pour," because some people simply couldn't stop working. And above it all, the stars stretched across the sky in a quiet shimmer. People looked up at them the same way we do today, with wonder, confusion, and a tiny hope that tomorrow might be kinder. In this darkness, surrounded by clay, bronze, wood, and dreams, the Shang were truly becoming a dynasty. Their cities were not huge yet, but they were alive, and every glowing torch, every bronze blade, every whispered offering was a step toward a future that would shape thousands of years of Chinese history.
Long before the Shang kings ruled with bronze blades and carved bones, the world felt full of spirits. The air itself seemed alive. Every stone, every tree, every passing breeze carried a whisper of something bigger than human life. To the Shang, the unseen world wasn't far away. It sat right beside them, watching, listening, and sometimes nudging things in strange directions. People believed that when someone died, they didn't disappear. They simply stepped into another room of the universe. A room where ancestors kept an eye on the living, like very serious grandparents who wanted everything done properly. These ancestors weren't just remembered, they were honored, respected, and consulted. The Shang didn't see life as a straight line. It was a circle where the living and the dead stayed in conversation. And at the center of that circle stood the king, a bridge between worlds. To understand a Shang king, you have to imagine a man who wasn't just a ruler, but a communicator with the heavens. He wasn't simply managing farmland or armies. He was managing relationships with spirits who could bless the kingdom or flip it upside down if ignored. Kings performed rituals to invite ancestors into the world of the living. They offered food, drink, jade, and sometimes animals, hoping to win favor or avoid disaster. A king might stand in the ritual courtyard with smoke curling around him, asking big questions. Will the harvest be good? Will the rains come? Will the enemy attack? Will someone please tell me why the river is angry again? These ceremonies weren't small, private acts. The whole kingdom's fate hung on them, and the people believed deeply that the king's bond with the spirits was what kept their world steady. But ancestors weren't the only spirits in the Shang imagination. The world was full of forces that felt powerful and unpredictable. There were sky spirits, river spirits, mountain spirits, storm spirits, each one believed to have a personality as moody as the Yellow River itself. The Shang didn't see nature as something separate from them. It was a living network of moods, choices, warnings, and blessings. A sudden storm wasn't just weather, it was a message. A good harvest wasn't just luck, it was a sign. Even strange dreams could be hints from the spirit world, little postcards from ancestors who wanted attention. This constant back and forth between the physical and spiritual worlds shaped everything the Shang people did. It set the rules, it guided decisions, and slowly it built a world where writing would soon become the bridge between human questions and divine answers. Surrounding him were specialists, people who spent their whole lives studying signs, symbols, dreams, and the delicate moods of the spirit world. Priests prepared offerings with movements as careful as surgeons. Diviners examined cracks in bones the way modern scientists study weather charts. Assistants arranged vessels, incense and jade in perfect order, because one wrong placement might annoy an ancestor, and honestly, no one wanted to deal with an annoyed ancestor. These specialists formed a quiet, powerful class in Shang society. They weren't warriors, but their influence ran deep. When they said the spirits were displeased, everyone listened. When they said the ancestors demanded something, leaders acted. Their words shaped political choices, farming cycles, even marriage decisions. It was a world run by both logic and belief, where the invisible carried as much weight as the visible. These rituals weren't random gatherings. They followed patterns older than memory. Each ceremony had its own rhythm: the lighting of fires, the washing of hands, the offering of bowls filled with food or drink, the gentle ringing of bells carved from bronze. People believed that sounds carried messages upward, riding the air toward ancestors who might be listening. The king often stood barefoot on packed earth, feeling the ground beneath him, as if waiting for an answer to rise through the soil. Sometimes the rituals were simple, small, quiet. Other times they stretched deep into the night, filled with chanting that rose and fell like waves. And through it all, the Shang people believed that the spirits were watching closely, deciding whether to bless or challenge the living. Ritual wasn't decoration, it was survival. But here's the interesting part. Even though the Shang world was full of spirits and ancestors, the people weren't fearful all the time. They saw the spiritual realm as a relationship, sometimes demanding, sometimes comforting, always present. When a harvest went well, families thanked their ancestors with warm smiles, offering little bowls of millet near household altars. When storms raged, they begged the river spirits to calm down, promising future offerings if the water behaved. Everyday life was threaded with tiny gestures of respect. A child might bow to a family shrine before bedtime. A farmer might whisper a quick thanks to the sky after rain. These acts didn't feel dramatic, they felt natural, like greeting a neighbor you saw every morning. This closeness between the living and the invisible shaped the way the Shang saw their world. It made the rise of kingship not just political, but spiritual. As the Shang kingdom grew stronger, the spiritual duties of the king grew heavier. People believed he wasn't just ruling them, he was standing in two worlds at once. In daylight, he settled disputes, organized labor, assigned warriors, and made decisions about farming and trade. But when the sun dipped, and the sky grew soft with evening light, another job called to him. That was the hour when ancestor spirits felt closest, when their messages drifted down like quiet echoes. The king would enter the ritual courtyard, where torches flickered in gentle patterns, and the ground smelled of earth warmed by the day's sun. He would kneel or stand before carved bones or jade tokens, asking questions only the spirits could answer. And even though he carried the weight of the kingdom on his shoulders, he did not stand alone. Behind him were the ancestors, hundreds of voices stretching back through time, watching, guiding, judging, protecting. Because of this deep connection with the spirit world, a Shang king was a different kind of leader. He was part ruler, part priest, part interpreter of mysteries. His decisions weren't based only on human logic, though he definitely needed some of that too, but on what the ancestors signaled through rituals. If the bones cracked one way, the king might order more farmland to be cleared. If they cracked another way, he might delay a battle or call for more offerings. People didn't see this as superstition, they saw it as wisdom. After all, who wouldn't want advice from ancestors who had seen everything before? This spiritual guidance wasn't just comforting, it was practical. It gave the king authority that no rival could easily challenge. You couldn't argue with a ruler who had an entire invisible council standing behind him. Many nights in the Shang kingdom ended with ritual firelight flickering across the packed earth courtyards, but some nights were quieter, softer, almost tender. These were the nights when families gathered at their own small household altars. Simple wooden shelves held small bowls, bits of jade or tiny carvings passed down through generations. Parents lit incense while children peeked around their legs, curious but respectful. Prayers were whispered, not shouted. Gratitude for food, hope for health, safety for travelers, wisdom for elders. Even the simplest household felt connected to something larger. The boundary between life and spirit wasn't a big dramatic doorway. It was a thin veil, a soft curtain that moved gently with every breath. And this sense of closeness shaped how the Shang people saw the world. Life wasn't just about surviving. It was about honoring the past while walking into the future with both courage and humility. In time, all these beliefs, ancestor worship, divination, rituals, spiritual duties, formed the backbone of Shang kingship. This wasn't a world where power came only from armies or wealth.
It came from being a good listener to forces beyond human sight. The king wasn't just strong, he was connected, linked to the past, responsible for the present, and trusted to read the signs of the future. This is why writing would soon become so important. Carving questions into bones wasn't just communication, it was the bridge between mortals and spirits. The beginnings of Chinese writing didn't rise from trade or poetry, they rose from a desire to understand the invisible. This spiritual foundation made the Shang kingdom unique, powerful, and ready for the next great leap. As torches went out, and the stars brightened overhead, the world of spirits settled around the land like a blanket. The Shang rested, knowing their ancestors were watching.
Life in the Shang kingdom didn't move at the speed of kings or rituals. It moved at the speed of sunlight, farming seasons, and tired feet. Before dawn even touched the sky, farmers were already awake, rubbing their eyes, stretching their backs, and stepping out into the cool morning air. The fields were waiting, as they always did, quiet rows of millet and wheat standing in the half-light like sleepy soldiers. These early farmers weren't flashy heroes. They didn't wear bronze armor or carry symbols of power. They carried wooden tools, baskets made of reeds, and a kind of patience that could probably outlast the mountains themselves. Their days were long, their work steady, and their hopes simple. Good weather, strong harvests, healthy families. And though the kingdom couldn't run without kings and priests, it also couldn't survive without these quiet hands working the soil. In a way, the real heartbeat of the Shang world lived here, between rows of crops. But farming wasn't the whole story. All throughout the Shang kingdom, small workshops buzzed with activity. Potters spun clay on simple wheels, shaping bowls and vessels with hands that barely needed to think. Their movements were smooth, practiced, almost musical. Jade carvers sat nearby, hunched over small stones that glowed pale green even in shadow. They worked slowly, carefully, shaving away tiny flakes to reveal ornaments hidden inside the rock. In another corner of the town, bone workers carved tools, needles, and small decorative pieces using techniques passed down for generations. The steady tapping of bone against stone, the soft scraping of jade, the warm smell of clay drying in the sun, all these sounds and scents blended together into the workshop's rhythm. These artisans didn't just make objects, they made identity. They shaped the culture the Shang would someday be remembered for. Every community in the Shang kingdom had its own rhythm. Markets spilled into open courtyards where traders gathered with baskets of vegetables, jars of oil, pottery, and the occasional jade piece, so beautiful it stopped people mid-step. Children ran between stalls chasing chickens or each other, ignoring adults telling them to watch your feet for the 100th time. Women wove cloth on wooden looms, their hands moving in calm patterns. Herdsmen guided goats and pigs through dusty paths, trying to keep them from wandering into someone else's garden. It was a lively dance of voices, footsteps, laughter, animals, and everyday chores. And even though life could be tiring, there was comfort in the routine. People knew their roles, their neighbors, their hopes. They knew when the rains usually came, when the markets felt busiest, when the spirits might need offerings. Life wasn't perfect, but it was connected, warm, and filled with purpose. Behind the hum of daily life stood the quiet backbone of the kingdom, the farmers' seasons. Life didn't follow clocks, it followed the sky. Spring meant planting, day after day of bending, digging, watering, and hoping the earth would be kind. Summer meant sweating under the sun, chasing pests, praying for rain, and sometimes yelling at the clouds in frustration when they refused to cooperate. Autumn was a mix of exhaustion and joy, as families harvested the grain that would keep them alive through winter. Children helped gather fallen stalks, while elders supervised with the seriousness of generals on a battlefield. Winter brought rest, but not laziness. Tools were repaired, stories were shared, and warm fires filled the nights with soft glow. Every cycle felt familiar, steady, and deeply important. In the Shang world, a year wasn't just time passing, it was a promise renewed again and again between people and land. The Shang kingdom wasn't just fields and workshops, it was also home to music, festivals, and food that brought people together. Evenings often carried the sound of drums made from stretched animal skins, wooden flutes singing gentle melodies, and small bronze bells chiming with bright, cheerful notes. When a good harvest came, whole villages joined in celebration. People cooked pots of millet porridge, roasted meat, poured drinks, and shared meals under the open sky. Children played games until their legs gave out, and adults laughed loudly, their worries melting for a night. Lanterns flickered in the breeze, painting warm circles of light on the ground. Even the elders, who usually walked with stiff backs, tapped their feet to the music. Joy rose like warm smoke drifting into the night. These moments held the kingdom together as much as any wall or weapon. Of course, not every part of Shang life was soft, calm, or musical. There was also hard labor, the kind that shaped the kingdom's structure day by day. Workers built roads, dug irrigation ditches, carried heavy loads of stone, wood, and grain, and mended tools until their hands were rough and scarred. These weren't glamorous jobs, but they mattered. Without irrigation channels, fields died.
Without roads, markets slowed to a crawl. Without firewood and stone, homes couldn't stand strong. And even though the work was tiring, there was a sense of shared purpose that made it bearable. The workers joked with each other, complained together, and found small joys in small breaks. They weren't kings or priests, but they were the ones who kept the kingdom breathing. Every ditch dug, every wall raised, every bridge patched was a quiet act of devotion to the world they depended on. In every Shang community, life also moved around family and home, the place where warmth lived even on the hardest days. Homes were made of wood, packed earth, and woven reeds, simple structures, but filled with the sounds of real living. Morning began with the crackle of fires, the quiet clatter of clay pots, and the soft footsteps of people starting their chores. Inside, families gathered around low hearths, eating warm millet porridge, sharing news, teasing each other, and planning the day. Children argued about who had to fetch water, parents laughed because they had the same argument when they were young. Evenings were gentler. After long hours of work, families sat together, mending clothes, carving tools, or simply resting with tired smiles. Grandparents told stories about ancestors, and the younger ones listened with wide eyes. These small moments built the soul of the Shang kingdom, far more than bronze or rituals ever could. And even though life seemed ordinary on the surface, every person in the Shang world carried a quiet awareness of duty and connection. Farmers knew their harvest fed the kingdom. Artisans knew their hands shaped tools that kept life running. Hunters knew their skills protected villages from wild animals and rival groups. Families knew their offerings kept ancestors close. Even children, small as they were, learned early that life wasn't lived alone. It stretched forward and backward. Forward into the future they were building, backward into the past that carried them. This sense of belonging gave every task a bit of weight, even the small ones like sweeping dust or feeding goats. No job felt useless, no person felt forgotten. In the rhythm of their days, the Shang people didn't just survive, they built something steady, peaceful, and rooted in meaning. A kingdom made not by kings, but by thousands of ordinary hands. As the sun dipped low each evening, the Shang kingdom softened into a calmer rhythm. Workers left the fields, brushing dust from their clothes. Artisans rested their hands after long hours shaping clay, jade, or bone. Livestock settled in, their calls echoing faintly across the town like a sleepy conversation. The sky deepened into warm shades of orange and purple, casting gentle light across rooftops and courtyards. Families prepared simple dinners, steam rising from clay pots as delicious smells drifted through the air. Some neighbors shared food, others shared stories, and some simply sat outside their homes enjoying the cool breeze after a long day. In these moments, the kingdom felt smaller, almost intimate. No wars, no rituals, no urgent decisions, just people breathing, resting, and remembering why they worked so hard. These evenings wrapped the Shang world in a sense of home, steady and warm. Night in the Shang kingdom carried its own quiet beauty. Lanterns lit narrow paths, glowing like soft stars fallen to earth. Gentle breezes moved through open windows, carrying the smell of cool soil and distant fires. Families gathered around low hearths, finishing chores and whispering stories before sleep. Elders prayed quietly at small household altars, thanking ancestors for guidance and asking for protection through the night. Children curled under woven blankets, dreaming of festivals, animals, or the strange magical world adults always talked about. Far away, the capital glowed like an ember, furnaces dimming, ritual spaces empty, guards watching the night with slow, steady breaths. And above everyone, the stars shimmered across the sky like a silent promise. In the stillness of these nights, the kingdom felt connected. Every home, every family, every heartbeat. Life was simple, but filled with meaning. And soon, writing would arrive to give these moments a voice that would last forever.
Long before writing appeared on bones and turtle shells, there was fire. The Shang people trusted flames the way we trust clocks and calendars today. Fire didn't just cook their meals, it revealed answers. On quiet nights when the air felt heavy with mystery, diviners gathered near glowing braziers, preparing the tools they used to speak with the unseen world. These tools weren't books or scrolls. They were turtle plastrons and ox scapulae, smooth, pale shells and bones that held secrets deep inside their fibers. People believed that when heat touched these objects, the spirits would crack them open with messages. Imagine sitting there, listening to the soft pop and snap of burning bone, watching tiny lines branch across the surface like frozen lightning. It wasn't magic to them, it was communication, and before writing even had a shape, the Shang were already carving questions into the darkness. The divination process began long before flames touched the bone. First, a diviner carved tiny hollows into the shell or scapula, small pits that would guide the heat later. These carvings looked simple, almost plain, but they were precise. Too shallow, and the cracks would be weak. Too deep, and the bone might split the wrong way. Once prepared, the bone was placed near the fire. The diviner held a heated bronze rod or poker, raising it slowly, letting the glow brighten until the tip looked like a drop of sunlight. Then, with steady breath, he pressed the hot tool into the carved pit. A sharp sound snapped through the air, a sudden pop, and thin cracks spread like spiderwebs. Everyone watching leaned in. This was the moment where the physical world met the spirit world, and whatever pattern formed, the Shang believed it carried meaning. But reading the cracks wasn't easy. Each line, curve, fork or angle meant something, and only trained diviners understood the language of these patterns. They studied them the way modern people study weather maps or financial charts. A straight crack might mean stability, a sharp bend might warn of conflict, a complex branching pattern could signal rain, sickness, or the displeasure of ancestors. And while the king often asked the questions about harvests, wars, hunts, childbirths, weather, the diviners shaped the answers. They interpreted the signs with calm voices, explaining what the ancestors seemed to be saying. Sometimes the message was comforting, good harvest, safe travel, easy birth. Other times it was a warning that left everyone uneasy. But no matter the outcome, the cracks guided decisions that shaped the entire kingdom. These tiny lines formed by heat and bone would soon become the birthplace of writing. Divination wasn't just a special event for big decisions. It was woven into daily life. If the king wanted to know whether the rains would come on time, he asked the bones. If a general wondered whether a campaign would succeed, he asked the bones. Even simple questions like whether a royal hunt would bring back enough game ended up carved into shells that glowed under firelight. People didn't see this as overthinking. They saw it as respect. After all, why stumble through life guessing when ancestors were ready to whisper answers? The ritual courtyard often filled with quiet footsteps as priests and assistants arranged bones, tended fires, and prepared tools. There was a calm rhythm to it, like the heartbeat of the kingdom. Every crack was a conversation. Every question carved into bone was an offering of trust. And every answer shaped the choices of thousands of people. But something important started happening during these rituals. Something no one realized at first. After reading the cracks, diviners began carving short notes beside them, simple markings that recorded the question or the answer. At first, these carvings were tiny, almost shy. A symbol here, a line there, maybe the date, maybe the subject. But slowly these markings grew more complex. They started forming patterns. They became recognizable shapes. They evolved into a language. It wasn't writing in the way we know writing today, but it was the seed, the beginning, the moment when spoken thoughts turned into scratches that could outlive the people who made them. Without meaning to, the Shang had created a way to hold memory still, a way to speak to the future. It all started with the bones. The beauty of this early writing was how practical it was. It didn't begin as poetry or philosophy. It began as record-keeping, for questions asked to spirits. Imagine a diviner carving. Will we have a good harvest? Or will the king's child be healthy? Or will rain come before the millet dries? These questions, simple as they were, became the foundation of the earliest Chinese script. Over time, more and more people learned to interpret the symbols. They realized that writing helped avoid confusion, kept knowledge clear, and preserved important messages long after memories faded. These bones became a library of spiritual conversations. When future kings wanted to understand the decisions of their ancestors, they simply read the carvings. Writing had become a bridge, not just between humans and spirits anymore, but between generations. As the practice of carving questions onto bones grew more common, the Shang court developed a group of specialists whose entire lives revolved around this strange new craft. These were the scribes, people who learned how to carve symbols cleanly, read them clearly, and organize them into something that made sense. They weren't warriors or farmers, but their work carried enormous weight. A single mistake could confuse a message meant for the king, or worse, misrepresent the words meant for the ancestors. So scribes trained patiently, carving stroke after stroke on scrap pieces of bone until their hands knew the shapes by heart. They learned to sit perfectly still, to steady their breath, and to hold the bronze tool with gentle precision. In a world where writing was just beginning, every carved symbol felt important, almost sacred. These scribes didn't just write, they built the foundation of written Chinese civilization, one careful line at a time. With time, the court began storing oracle bones in large pits and structured archives, almost like early libraries. But these libraries didn't have shelves or scrolls. They had piles of bones arranged by topic. There were bones about harvests, bones about military campaigns, bones about royal births, bones about sickness, even bones about dreams. Each one was a frozen conversation with the spirit world. And when a new king took the throne, he could study these old records, learning from past choices, avoiding old mistakes, and following the guidance that earlier rulers believed came from their ancestors. Imagine him kneeling beside a pit filled with carved bones, running his fingers over ancient cracks, reading questions asked decades before he was born. It must have felt like touching time itself. Writing, once a small helper in rituals, had become a tool of memory, strategy, and kingship. As the centuries moved on, the cracks on the bones began to speak louder, not just to diviners but to the entire Shang kingdom. People noticed that the symbols carved beside the cracks weren't random scratches anymore. They had patterns, shapes, and meanings that repeated across different bones. Slowly, the symbols became more recognizable, more stable, more standardized. They began to look like the early ancestors of modern Chinese characters. The Shang didn't set out to invent a writing system.
They simply wanted clearer messages for the ancestors, but the ancestors, if you believe in that sort of thing, seemed to nudge them towards something greater. And so writing grew, step by small step, carved into bone, hardened by fire, preserved by earth. It wasn't poetry yet, and it wasn't literature, but it was something powerful, a way to capture human thought so it wouldn't disappear, a way to anchor memory, a way to build a civilization on words that didn't fade with the speaker's breath. By the end of the Shang era, writing had become more than a ritual tool, it was the kingdom's heartbeat. Every important decision, every royal birth, every harvest prediction, every war question, was carved into bone or shell. These weren't just records, they were witnesses. They held the hopes and fears of generations, and even though the Shang Dynasty would one day fall, the writing they created would survive, carried into the Zhou Dynasty and beyond. Their script would evolve, simplify, change shape, and grow until it became one of the oldest living writing systems in the world. But it all started here, beside warm fires, in the hands of diviners, in the cracks of heated bone. A simple need for answers created something eternal, and as the last embers faded in a Shang ritual courtyard, the world stepped quietly toward written history, guided by lines of fire.
Long before books, scrolls, or ink brushes existed, writing in China began with something far more humble, a question, a simple question carved into a hard surface, steady, careful, almost shy. These carvings didn't look like writing yet, but they were the spark. Imagine a bone lying beside a fire, its smooth surface glowing softly in the orange light. A scribe kneels beside it, bronze tool in hand, carving small marks to record the king's words. Will the rains come? Will the harvest be good? Will the ancestors bless the newborn child? These early marks weren't art or literature. They were little anchors thrown into the future, holding moments still so they could be read again. Nothing about them felt grand at the time. Just a record, just a note, just a question. But history was watching, and the world was about to change because humans were learning how to capture thought. At first they were pictures, tiny drawings of the things people cared about. A sun, a mountain, a river, a field of crops, a person kneeling, a child, a bow, a fish. Simple shapes that hinted at the world around them. But the Shang scribes were not trying to make pretty drawings. They were trying to solve a problem. How do you take a spoken idea, something floating and invisible, and trap it on something solid so it can speak again later? So the pictures grew sharper, cleaner, more consistent. One scribe carved a symbol, and another copied it. A third copied the copy. Soon a whole group of symbols spread across the kingdom, each one becoming a tiny building block of meaning. These weren't doodles anymore, they were words made visible. The more questions the Shang asked, the more symbols they needed. Life was complicated after all. You couldn't explain a drought with just a picture of the sun. You couldn't describe a king's illness with only a stick figure person. So scribes began combining symbols. One for the idea, one for the sound, one for extra meaning. A symbol for water, combined with a symbol for mouth, created something new. Thirst. A symbol for wood joined with a symbol for axe, cutting. Slowly, beautifully, the script grew from simple pictures into a system, a language carved in bone. A language of lines, angles and curves that carried emotion, fear, hope, and memory. No one knew it at the time, but these combinations were the ancestors of Chinese characters still used today. Thousands of years later, people would write with brushes and pens, but the heart of the script began here, in the soft glow of ancient fires. As the script grew, the Shang scribes started developing rules, not written rules, but shared habits that slowly became tradition. Horizontal lines meant one thing, vertical strokes meant another. A symbol with 3 marks could mean water, add another mark and suddenly it meant deep water, rushing water, dangerous water. Writing wasn't just about copying shapes anymore, it was about understanding how meaning could shift with a single line. Scribes practiced these rules every day, carving symbols onto scraps of bone until their hands felt the rhythm. Their workspaces were quiet except for the soft scrape of bronze tools and the warm crackle of nearby fires. Over time, a script emerged that was no longer just pictures. It was a living system, flexible enough to grow with the kingdom, a system that allowed people to express more than fear or hope. They could express detail, emotion, intention. The world was opening. With clearer symbols came clearer records. For the first time, the Shang people could track patterns in their own history. They could look back at old bones and see how many times the rains came late, how often the hunts failed, which sacrifices pleased the ancestors, or how previous battles unfolded. Writing gave them something priceless, memory that didn't fade, and memory gave them confidence. When a king faced a difficult decision, he didn't have to rely only on instinct or rumor. He could study past questions, compare past outcomes, and shape better choices. Writing became a tool for power, not just spiritual power, but political power. The kings who understood this weren't just ruling a kingdom, They were ruling time itself, reaching into past years for guidance. The oracle bones slowly transformed from spiritual tools into early forms of archives, and the Shang world grew steadier because of it. As the script expanded, scribes needed more space to write, so bones became covered with rows of neat, sharp symbols. Some bones carried long messages, questions, interpretations, results, even names and dates. These longer inscriptions allowed stories to grow, not just moments. Scribes could describe events, not only predict them. They could record illnesses, victories, offerings, and dreams. They could track the lives of kings, queens, warriors, and children. And with each new carving, the script became more permanent. Watching a scribe work must have felt almost magical. He bent over the bone, carving lines that would outlast him by thousands of years. Maybe the fire flickered, maybe the night was quiet, but in that moment, he was capturing a piece of reality, a piece of life. When the Shang kingdom eventually faded, their voices would still remain, preserved in symbols sharp as the day they were carved. Writing, once a whisper, had become a roar. As writing became more common in the Shang court, something interesting happened. Scribes began teaching others. Not everyone, of course. Writing was still a privilege, a rare skill reserved for people trusted with the king's words. But within the palace and the divination halls, a small community of learners grew. Young apprentices sat beside older scribes, copying symbols onto scraps of bone the same way children today copy letters in school. Their hands trembled at first, but the movements became smoother with time. They practiced the shape of each line, the angle of each stroke, the spacing between symbols. Sometimes they carved too deeply and cracked the bone. Sometimes their lines wobbled like tired legs. But slowly, quietly, with patience and repetition, they learned. In these lessons passed from one generation to the next, the script found stability. Writing stopped being a fragile experiment and became a tradition. As more people learned to write, the script began to travel. It moved between cities, spread through royal courts, and followed the king's messengers across the kingdom. Even if most common villagers never learned it, they still saw its marks on bones, pottery, tools, and ritual objects. The sight of carved symbols became a quiet reminder that the kingdom wasn't just a place of fields and workshops, it was a place of knowledge. Writing gave the Shang a sense of identity that stretched beyond village walls. It connected faraway regions, helped coordinate trade, shaped laws, and strengthened royal authority. A kingdom with writing felt more stable, more unified, more rooted. Even without knowing how to read, villagers sensed its power. These carved lines belonged to a world larger than daily life, a world where kings spoke to spirits and left messages for centuries to come. As the Shang script matured, something beautiful unfolded. The symbols slowly drifted beyond pure practicality and began to show traces of creativity. Tiny flourishes here, subtle curves there, the early hint of artistic expression. Scribes didn't just carve because they had to, some carved because they loved the shape of meaning. Characters grew balanced, elegant, almost musical in their structure. A symbol for river flowed like water, a symbol for mountain stood firm and proud, a symbol for king held its head high, just like the man it represented. The script had personality now, a quiet voice shaped by centuries of fire, bone, and human hands. And within that voice you could hear the first heartbeat of written Chinese culture, something that would one day give birth to poems, histories, philosophies, and stories that stretched across thousands of years. Writing wasn't just surviving anymore, it was growing. By the end of the Shang Dynasty, writing had become a force that shaped everything: rituals, politics, memory, identity. It was the thread connecting kings to ancestors, leaders to people, and the past to the future. Even when the Shang fell, their script refused to die. The Zhou carried it forward. Later dynasties shaped it, refined it, expanded it. Eventually the characters written on bone became the ancestors of millions of modern Chinese words. If a Shang scribe could see a modern city today, glowing with neon signs and printed books, he might faint from shock, but he would still recognize the shapes. The same strokes, the same structure, the same spirit. It all began with cracks on bone and questions whispered into firelight. Out of heat, silence, and faith, writing was born. And from writing, a whole civilization found its voice.
When writing finally took root in the Shang kingdom, someone had to protect it, teach it, and shape it. That responsibility fell to the scribes, a quiet group of people who lived in the background of history but held the entire kingdom's memory in their hands. Their lives didn't look dramatic from the outside. No glittering armor, no heroic battles. Instead, their days began with soft light slipping through window openings and the warm smell of burning incense. They sat in simple workrooms filled with bones, shells, tools, and carefully arranged samples of earlier carvings. Their job was steady and delicate. They carved the questions of the king. They carved the messages of the court. They carved the whispers of ancestors, so they wouldn't disappear. Each stroke mattered. Each line carried weight. And in the silence of those rooms, you could almost hear the future forming letter by letter. Training to become a scribe wasn't easy. Apprentices spent years learning how to sit still, how to hold a carving tool, how to breathe steadily while making long, controlled strokes.
They copied symbols again and again until their hands remembered the shapes better than their minds did. Mistakes were common, bones cracking in the wrong place, symbols carved too deep or too crooked. Some apprentices cried in frustration, some tried to hide their broken bones, but patient teachers sat beside them, correcting angles, adjusting grip, reminding them that mastery came slowly. And when an apprentice carved a perfectly balanced character for the first time, the whole room felt it. The quiet pride, the small victory. Becoming a scribe wasn't just learning a skill, it was becoming part of a tradition, a chain of knowledge stretching backward and forward through time. They weren't nobles, but they stood close to power. They worked near the king, near the priests, near the heart of the kingdom's decisions. When generals wanted to consult past battles, they came to the scribes. When priests needed to record omens, they came to the scribes. When the king wanted to immortalize a great event or hide a mistake, he turned to the scribes. Their rooms became the kingdom's memory, their tools became extensions of their thoughts. And though they lived quiet lives, the truth is simple. Without their hands, the Shang Dynasty would have vanished into the fog of time. Instead, their work preserved the heartbeat of an entire civilization. As time passed, the scribes became more than simple record keepers. They turned into interpreters of the kingdom's memory. When someone in the court needed to understand an old prophecy, a past warning, or the meaning of a strange crack on a bone, the scribes explained it. They knew the patterns better than anyone. They could look at a bone carved years earlier and read it as easily as a river tracker reads currents. Their minds held countless symbols, dates, and events, woven together like threads in a tapestry. Sometimes they worked alone, heads bent in concentration. Other times they gathered in small groups, comparing bones, debating interpretations, arguing gently about the meaning of a particular stroke. They weren't loud thinkers, they were steady ones, quiet ones, the kind of people who didn't need to shout to be heard. Their workspaces were simple but deeply meaningful. Shelves made of wood or packed earth held rows of bones sorted by subject, harvest predictions, military campaigns, royal births, illnesses, dreams, storms, omens. Every bone carried a story, and every story had a place. Clay pots held carving tools. Small bowls held ink for marking guidelines. Sometimes a stray chicken wandered inside, only to be shooed out by an irritated apprentice who feared it might scatter carefully arranged bones. The air smelled of ash, old earth, and warm smoke. And everywhere you looked, symbols covered surfaces like quiet footprints of time. These rooms weren't temples, but in a way they felt sacred. They were where memory slept, waiting to be woken by someone who knew how to read it. Even though their work seemed calm, the pressure on scribes was real. Important messages depended on them. Misreading a symbol could send the army to the wrong place. Forgetting a stroke could change the meaning of a prophecy. Some scribes carried this weight quietly, letting it make them more careful. Others carried it like a stone in their stomachs, taking long walks before rituals to steady their nerves. But no matter how they handled the stress, they understood something essential. Their work connected lives, their carvings shaped the future, their interpretations guided the kingdom, and their writing, small, sharp, steady, stitched the present to the past. They were guardians of meaning, and they took that role with a seriousness that echoed through generations. The scribes didn't just carve bones in silence, they also acted as teachers, passing their knowledge to the next generation. Inside small study rooms, apprentices sat in rows, each with a practice bone in front of them. The teacher walked slowly between them, correcting angles, adjusting grips, and murmuring quiet advice. Students learned not only how to carve, but how to think. They studied patterns of cracks, memorized old inscriptions, and learned the stories behind major prophecies. Some lessons lasted hours, some lasted days, and sometimes a single symbol took a whole evening to master. Apprentices often drifted to sleep with the shapes of characters still echoing in their minds. This constant teaching ensured that writing didn't fade or twist over time. It kept the script steady, safe, alive. As their skills grew, scribes began working on larger projects, cataloging older inscriptions, gathering bones from past reigns, and arranging them into chronological sequences. In a way, they became the first historians of China. They traced the rise and fall of harvests, the moods of the ancestors, the outcomes of wars, the illnesses of kings. They noticed patterns no one else saw. Cycles of storms, repeating omens, the way certain symbols changed meaning over decades. These observations didn't just help the court make decisions, they also shaped the way the Shang understood the world. Knowledge wasn't something floating in the air anymore. It had weight, form, carved lines, and in the hands of these scribes, knowledge turned into wisdom. By now, writing had woven itself so deeply into Shang life that scribes became the quiet anchors of the kingdom. When a prince was born, scribes recorded it. When a ruler fell ill, scribes carved messages asking the ancestors for guidance. When a great hunt succeeded or failed, scribes documented the outcome.
They stood in palace halls during important meetings, ready to record decisions. They stood in the ritual courtyard during divination, ready to capture the cracks. Some scribes even traveled with army leaders, carrying tools and bones so that generals could consult the ancestors far from home. They didn't fight, but their presence shaped battles all the same. Their records carried a power stronger than bronze, a power of memory. With each careful stroke, they ensured that nothing important slipped into the fog of time. In the end, the scribes became more than workers, they became keepers of the kingdom's soul. They preserved the thoughts of kings, the warnings of ancestors, and the stories of countless lives. Long after the Shang Dynasty itself disappeared, the bones they carved continued speaking. Archaeologists thousands of years later would pull these bones from the earth, brush off the dust, and read characters still sharp, still clear, still alive. Without realizing it, the scribes had achieved something extraordinary. They made time bend, they made voices survive, they made memory eternal. Their quiet rooms, their small tools, their humble discipline, all of it shaped the future of China. And as the last torch flickered in a scribe's workshop at night, the written word glowed in the darkness like a promise that stories would never be lost again.
As the Shang kingdom grew stronger, the world around it didn't stay peaceful. Neighboring clans watched with nervous eyes, and distant tribes whispered about the rising power in the east. The Shang didn't go looking for fights, but they weren't afraid of them either. Their leaders knew that a kingdom doesn't survive on rituals alone, it also survives on strength. And so the Shang army began to take shape, moving from small bands of hunters to organized groups of warriors. Bronze weapons glinted in the sun, axes with sharp edges, spears balanced for long throws, dagger axes curved like the smile of a predator. The sound of training echoed across the plains, grunts, shouts, the clashing of metal against shields. Beneath all this noise was a simple truth. The Shang were no longer just protecting villages, they were preparing to command a kingdom. But the true symbol of Shang military power wasn't the sword or spear, it was the war chariot. When people first heard the rumble of wheels rolling over packed earth, they knew something had changed. Chariots allowed warriors to move faster than ever before. They could strike hard, retreat quickly, and command the battlefield with surprising elegance. Imagine 2 horses, sleek and strong, pulling a wooden platform bound with leather and bronze. A warrior stood at the front with a spear or bow, wind whipping through his hair. Another controlled the reins, guiding the chariot with sharp turns. The sight of these chariots charging across the plains must have felt like watching thunder roll toward you. The Shang didn't invent the chariot, but they mastered it, turning it into a symbol of control, discipline, and momentum. With chariots, the Shang expanded their reach. They traveled greater distances, explored new territories, and asserted control over rival groups. Some battles were fierce, others ended before they began, with smaller clans surrendering at the mere sight of bronze weapons and thundering wheels. But expansion wasn't just about force. The Shang also offered alliances, protection, trade opportunities, and connections to their powerful ritual system. Many clans preferred joining the Shang world rather than resisting it. And so the kingdom grew, not all at once, but steadily, village by village, valley by valley. Every new stretch of land meant new resources, new people, new responsibilities. And beneath all this movement, the war chariot remained the beating heart of Shang military strength, its wheels carving lines into the earth that traced the shape of a rising dynasty. The Shang army didn't rely on chariots alone. Behind those rolling platforms came ranks of infantry warriors, marching in tight formation with blades, shields, and a determination that came from knowing they were defending something bigger than themselves. Many of these soldiers were farmers most of the year, and fighters when duty called. They knew the land well, the hidden dips in the earth, the narrow river crossings, the best places to ambush an enemy or defend a village. Their training wasn't as glamorous as the charioteers, but it was steady and disciplined. Under the heat of the sun, they practiced forming lines, raising shields, advancing in unison. The sound of hundreds of feet hitting the ground at once traveled across the plains like rolling thunder. Together, the infantry and the chariots formed a powerful force, a combination of speed, strength, and strategy that made the Shang feared across the region. But war for the Shang wasn't only about battles. It was also about managing relationships with neighboring tribes. Some groups resisted fiercely and became long-term enemies. Others respected the Shang's strength and sought partnership. Leaders from distant villages sometimes arrived in the capital carrying gifts, jade, pottery, animals, hoping to secure peace or trade privileges. These meetings weren't quiet affairs. Warriors stood at attention, scribes recorded every word, priests watched the sky for signs from ancestors. The Shang king listened calmly, deciding whether this new group would be treated as a friend, a subject, or a threat. A single conversation could change the direction of a border, a season, or a generation. And while the war chariot stood outside the palace as reminders of what would happen if negotiations failed, many clans chose peace. After all, Joining a strong kingdom often felt safer than standing alone. Even when peace was chosen, the Shang never let their guard down. Scouts patrolled the borders, watching for movement, listening for rumors, studying tracks in the dirt. They moved quietly through forests, across plains and along riverbanks, reading the landscape like an open book. A broken branch might signal intruders. Fresh footprints might indicate a raiding party. A disturbed riverbank could mean enemy scouts were nearby. These Shang scouts didn't carry heavy armor or ride chariots. They carried knowledge. They were the kingdom's eyes and ears, alert and sharp even when the rest of the land seemed quiet. Thanks to them, the Shang kings often knew about danger long before it reached the city walls. Their work wasn't loud, but it was essential. In a world of shifting alliances, early warnings could mean survival. When battles finally came, they were fast, loud, and unpredictable. The Shang didn't fight in endless lines like later kingdoms would. Their style was more fluid, almost like watching storms collide. Chariots charged in sweeping arcs, kicking up walls of dust that blurred the horizon. Infantry rushed forward in tight waves, shields locked, spears braced. Bronze weapons clanged with sharp ringing notes that echoed across the fields. Horses snorted and stamped, their muscles trembling with adrenaline. Some warriors carried drums, beating steady rhythms to guide the troops, deep, powerful booms that rolled across the land like the heartbeat of the battlefield. Even in the chaos there was structure. Every move had purpose, every charge had timing. The Shang weren't just strong, they were organized, clever, and fiercely determined to protect what they had built. After battles ended, the land fell into a strange, heavy quiet. Survivors returned to camp with slow steps, their bodies aching and their minds worn thin. The Shang army wasn't cruel. They honored their dead, treated their wounded, and offered thanks to ancestors for protection. Priests lit incense near the battlefield, letting the smoke rise slowly into the sky like a message carried upward. Scribes arrived soon after, recording what had happened, who fought bravely, who fell, what tactics succeeded, and what the omens before the battle meant. Warriors sat around low fires, cleaning their weapons, sharing food, and letting exhaustion settle into their bones. Some stared into the flames without speaking, others laughed softly, grateful simply to be alive. In these moments, the army felt less like a machine, and more like a family, a group of people bound by fear, courage, and the simple desire to see home again. As the Shang expanded their territory, the kingdom didn't grow in sharp lines on a map, it grew in gentle waves. A new valley came under Shang influence, not just because chariots passed through it, but because trade followed, rituals spread, and people began trusting in the Shang way of life. Farmers in distant villages learned new farming techniques. Local leaders adopted Shang bronze tools. Families began honoring ancestors with Shang-style offerings. Over time, these different groups blended into a wider cultural circle, connected by shared beliefs and shared protection. Even places that had once resisted the Shang began to see the benefits: safer roads, stronger alliances, more predictable harvests thanks to Shang divination. Expansion wasn't only about conquest, it was about connection, reaching out across distances and turning scattered communities into something that felt like one world. In time, the war chariot became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of Shang identity, a sign of discipline, unity, and power. When people heard wheels rumbling in the distance, they didn't just think of battle, they thought of protection, stability, the strength of a kingdom that could move with speed and purpose across its lands. Even in peaceful days, seeing a chariot roll through a village filled people with a quiet pride. It meant the Shang were strong, it meant the kingdom was watching, it meant the world they lived in, the rituals, the writing, the farms, the families, was safe for now. And as the sun set on another long day, wheels creaking gently as chariots returned home, the Shang people looked toward the horizon with confidence. Their dynasty was rising, and the land knew it.
The Shang capital wasn't a peaceful village hidden in the hills. It was alive. You could hear it long before you reached its gates. The thud of bronze being hammered into shape, the creak of wooden carts rolling over packed earth, the calls of traders advertising fresh grain, pottery or cloth, the laughter of children running through narrow lanes. Smoke curled from hundreds of hearths carrying the scents of meals being prepared. Millet porridge, roasted meat, steamed vegetables. Dogs barked. Roasters crowed. A distant drum marked time for workers in the bronze foundries. And rising above it all were the tall earthen platforms of the palace and ritual zones, standing like quiet guardians over the bustling city. Life in the Shang capital never slept. It simply shifted from one rhythm to another, every hour of every day. Inside the foundries, where bronze was melted and shaped, the air shimmered with heat. Workers stood shoulder to shoulder, sweat glistening on their arms as they poured molten metal into clay molds. The sound of hammering echoed like steady thunder. Sparks danced through the dim glow, lighting up faces focused on their craft. These workers weren't just making tools or weapons, they were creating symbols of the kingdom's strength. Every axe, every blade, every ritual vessel held a piece of the city's identity.
Bronze wasn't just metal here, it was pride, it was connection, and when the workers stepped outside for a breath of cool air, wiping their brows and stretching their tired backs, they knew they were part of something bigger. Their hands shaped the power of the Shang. Beyond the workshops, the residential areas of the capital felt calmer, even gentle. Homes made of packed earth and timber lined the walkways, each one holding the quiet pulse of family life. In the mornings, parents tended small gardens or fetched water from communal wells, while children followed behind, half helping and half playing. Inside, simple clay pots simmered over low fires, filling rooms with warmth and the soft bubbling of breakfast porridge. Families gathered for meals, sharing stories from the day before, teasing each other, planning the chores ahead. In the middle of all this, small household altars stood against the walls, shrines to ancestors who watched over the family. A tiny bowl of food, a stick of incense, a carved charm. These spaces reminded everyone that the home was not just a place to eat and sleep, it was a bridge between the living and the past. As the sun climbed higher, the marketplaces of the Shang capital burst into full motion. Traders from nearby villages and sometimes distant regions poured into the city with carts piled high. There were baskets overflowing with fresh vegetables, bundles of firewood stacked like towers, jars of oil sealed with clay, and pottery decorated with simple swirl patterns. People browsed slowly, touching the goods, asking questions, bargaining with warm smiles or narrowed eyes. Children chased each other between stalls while dogs lounged in whatever patch of shade they could find. The marketplace wasn't just a place to buy things, it was where news traveled, where gossip spread, where stories drifted through the air like smoke. A lost goat, a surprise storm, a dream someone had that might have been a message. In this lively circle of trade and chatter, the capital felt like a single breathing organism. Not far from the markets, skilled artisans filled the craft districts with steady rhythms of work. Jade carvers sat in doorways, sunlight catching the pale green stone as they shaped it grain by grain. Bone workers strung necklaces made from polished fragments. Cloth weavers stretched thread across wooden frames, their hands moving in long, comforting patterns that almost sounded like a gentle drumbeat. Each artisan carried knowledge passed down through generations, and though their work demanded patience, their creations held deep meaning. A jade pendant could become a family treasure, a carefully carved bone charm might be used in rituals for years, a strong woven cloth could keep a child warm through winter. These artisans didn't just make objects, they shaped memories and traditions that would outlast them. Closer to the palace, life felt more formal. Officials walked with purpose, carrying bundles of oracle bones, clay tablets for notes or messages sealed with carved wooden tokens. Guards stood watch along wide pathways, their bronze spearheads catching flashes of sunlight. Scribes hurried between rooms, preparing inscriptions for rituals or returning records to the archives. Priests offered incense at outdoor altars, whispering prayers that blended with the soft sound of rustling banners. Even the air felt different here, quieter, heavier, as if every building were paying attention. People spoke more softly, footsteps landed more carefully. Everyone understood that decisions made in these buildings shaped the entire kingdom. It was a place where power lived not in loud displays, but in calm voices and thoughtful rituals. As afternoon settled across the capital, the palace's ritual district grew busier. This was where priests prepared offerings, studied omens, and spoke to ancestors through smoke and carved bone. Fires crackled in stone-lined pits as attendants heated bronze vessels filled with fragrant herbs. Diviners inspected new oracle bones brought in from storage, running their fingers over the smooth surfaces as if reacquainting themselves with old friends. Jade ornaments glimmered on nearby tables, ready to be placed in ceremonial bowls. Ordinary citizens sometimes paused outside the ritual walls, listening for the soft chants that drifted outward. They knew these rituals weren't just theater, these ceremonies guided the kingdom. One reading could shift when crops were planted, another could decide whether warriors marched north or stayed home. Even in a loud capital, the ritual district held a silence that felt powerful, ancient and alive. Outside the palace, the city's working districts began to slow as the sun dipped lower. Workshops quieted, the hammering of bronze softened, the shouting of traders faded into murmurs. Families gathered outside their homes to finish chores while the air was still warm. Someone swept dust from the doorway. Someone fetched water for the evening meal. Children played one last round of games before their parents called them in with sharp but loving voices. In this gentle shift between day and night, the capital felt peaceful in a way that morning bustle never allowed. Smoke from cooking fires drifted into the sky in thin twisting lines, carrying the smell of porridge, broth and roasted grain. Even those who had worked all day found a moment to breathe, stretch and enjoy the fading light. This was the hour when the city exhaled. As evening settled fully over the Shang capital, the city transformed into something softer. Lanterns flickered to life along the main paths, casting warm pools of light that danced as the wind brushed past. Families gathered inside their homes, sitting around low hearths as pots simmered gently. The sounds of the day faded into a quiet chorus, crackling firewood, distant voices, the soft thump of footsteps returning home. Elders told stories to children, stories filled with spirits, brave ancestors, and lessons carved into the bones of memory.
Even those who worked in the palace finally stepped outside, inhaling the cool air after long hours bent over tools or altars. The capital felt smaller at night, almost intimate, as if every home were a tiny star in a constellation of warm lights. It was a moment of pause, a reminder that even in a great kingdom, life was lived one quiet evening at a time. When night deepened, the ritual fires near the palace burned brightest. Priests performed late ceremonies, offering food, drink, and whispered prayers to the ancestors. The flames cast long shadows across the packed earth platforms, stretching like dark fingers into the quiet streets. Some citizens paused from afar, watching the glow with respect. Others knelt at small household altars, performing their own family rituals in harmony with the great ones. Above them, stars shimmered faintly, as if listening. In those still hours, the capital felt balanced, half living, half spiritual. The day belonged to workers, traders, and families. The night belonged to ancestors, voices older than memory. And in the space between the two, the Shang people carried a sense of connection that made their world feel whole. This blend of daily life and sacred duty carved the rhythm of the capital, shaping a dynasty that would echo long after its last fire went out.
At the very center of the Shang capital stood the king's court, a place where decisions shaped the rhythm of the entire kingdom. It wasn't a grand stone palace like later dynasties would build. Instead, it rose from the earth itself, built with packed soil, timber beams, and sweeping roofs that caught the light in warm colors. Still, the moment you stepped inside, you felt the weight of authority. Officials moved with practiced calm, scribes carried bundles of oracle bones across courtyards, and guards watched each doorway with sharp, steady eyes. The king's presence filled the space even when he wasn't visible. His voice could decide when armies marched, when crops were planted, when rituals were held, and though the court buzzed with activity, there was an underlying stillness, like the moment before a storm or the breath just before speaking a difficult truth. This was where power lived. Every morning, long before the sun touched the rooftops, the court awakened. Servants swept walkways, prepared ritual spaces, and arranged offerings for the day's ceremonies. Officials arrived with clay tablets and bundles of bone inscriptions, discussing matters of harvests, board attentions, trade, and omens. The king entered last. His steps were deliberate, his posture firm, his expression calm but unreadable. People bowed deeply as he passed, not out of fear but out of recognition. He stood between the living and the ancestors. His decisions came from both human judgment and spiritual guidance. Some days he listened quietly while advisors spoke. Other days he asked pointed questions, testing their understanding of the kingdom's needs. The court wasn't a place of loud arguments. It was a place of careful words, long pauses, and choices that carried the weight of thousands of lives. The king's advisors formed a circle of influence around him, each one trusted for a different reason. Some were skilled in agriculture and understood the behavior of river floods and soil. Others were military leaders who knew the movements of rival clans. Priests spoke for the ancestors, delivering messages from rituals and divination sessions. Scribes preserved every decision, carving the king's words into bone so future generations could remember them. Together they shaped the fate of the Shang. Their meetings were filled with quiet debate, respectful nods, and the soft sound of scribes carving symbols onto smoothed surfaces. And through it all, the king listened. He did not rule alone. His strength came from this council of careful minds, loyal hearts, and steady hands. It was a system built on balance, human wisdom guided by ancestral whispers. Throughout the day he moved between different parts of the palace complex, each space designed for a specific kind of duty. Some areas were for legal matters, where he listened to disputes brought by local leaders. Others were private chambers, where he studied reports from scouts or examined maps carved into bamboo or wood. In the ritual courtyard he stood beneath banners fluttering in the wind, offering food and incense to the ancestors. He wasn't simply a ruler, he was a bridge, a living thread connecting the kingdom to forces that stretched far beyond human reach. And everywhere he went, people stepped aside with deep respect. They knew the weight he carried. Even his moments of rest were filled with quiet thought, as if he were always listening for something only he could hear. One of the king's most important roles was leading and overseeing ritual ceremonies. These weren't small or symbolic tasks. They were the foundation of Shang belief. The king knelt before altars decorated with jade, bronze vessels, and offerings of grain, meat, or wine. Priests chanted beside him, their voices rising and falling like slow-moving waves. The scent of burning herbs drifted upward, carrying prayers toward the heavens. When divination was needed, the king asked the questions himself, trusting the cracks of the bones to reveal the ancestors' guidance. Every decision, harvests, wars, alliances, punishments, was connected to these rituals. If the spirits approved, the kingdom grew stronger. If they warned of danger, the king acted quickly to protect his people. Ritual wasn't separate from government. Ritual was government. Yet for all his authority, the king was not immune to fear or doubt. When omens looked unclear, or when storms ruined crops, or when enemies gathered on distant plains, he felt the weight of every anxious eye turned toward him.
In private, he consulted with his closest advisors, sometimes late into the night. They studied old bones, searching for patterns from past generations. They whispered about alliances, dangers, and strange dreams that might signal change. The king listened carefully, asking the same question again and again in different ways, hoping the ancestors would give a clearer answer. Leadership in the Shang court wasn't about ruling with iron certainty, it was about balancing courage with humility, action with patience, and human judgment with spiritual guidance. And in those quiet, heavy moments, the king felt deeply, painfully human. Surrounding the king were the court officials, a group of men whose responsibilities kept the entire kingdom running smoothly. Some oversaw agriculture, making sure irrigation ditches were repaired and fields were planted on time. Others monitored trade routes, ensuring that goods flowed safely between villages. Military officers trained soldiers and maintained chariots. Ritual overseers coordinated ceremonies so that offerings were made at the right hour, on the right day with the right items. Each official carried a bundle of notes or oracle bone excerpts, their faces marked with the quiet seriousness of men who knew mistakes carried consequences. In the courtyards they spoke softly to one another, exchanging updates, debating priorities, and preparing reports for the king. Their work wasn't glamorous, but it held the dynasty together. Without their diligence, the mighty Shang kingdom would have unraveled one thread at a time. But not all power in the court came from administrators or military leaders. Much of it flowed from the king's extended family, brothers, cousins, uncles, and sons who each held influence in their own regions. Some ruled nearby cities as representatives of the king, others commanded troops or managed ritual duties. Their loyalty strengthened the dynasty, but their ambition always lingered beneath the surface. Court meetings involving royal relatives felt delicate, like walking across thin ice. Everyone smiled, bowed, and spoke politely, yet their eyes watched everything. Who gained the king's favor today? Who lost it? Who stepped forward too eagerly, or remained too quiet? Families could support a dynasty, but they could also shake its foundation. The king understood this better than anyone. His calm presence wasn't just ceremonial, it was strategic, a steady hand guiding a circle of people who could either strengthen the throne or challenge it. As evening approached, the king often stepped out onto one of the raised earthen terraces overlooking the capital. From there he could see everything, the smoke drifting from family hearths, the workers heading home, the glow of furnaces dimming in the bronze foundries, chariots lined up neatly along the training grounds, priests prepared their evening rituals near the altars, their white robes catching the last orange light of the day. The king stood in silence, letting the breeze brush past him, carrying scents of earth, smoke, and cooked grain. Moments like this reminded him of the weight he carried. His decisions shaped not only the present, but the generations yet to come, and though he wore fine robes, he felt the same worries as any person: fear of failure, hope for peace, and the desire to leave something strong behind. In the stillness, the city felt like a living promise he was responsible for protecting. When night finally settled in, the king's day wasn't truly over. He returned to a quiet room lit by a few oil lamps, where scribes brought him the final reports of the day: border sightings, market tallies, ritual interpretations, and messages from distant towns. The room felt almost sacred, filled with carved bones, bronze vessels, and the soft scratching sound of tools writing down his responses. This was where the true heart of kingship lived, not in ceremonies, not in public appearances, but in these late hours of thought, responsibility, and reflection. Here he weighed the needs of thousands. Here he shaped the path the dynasty would walk. Outside, the capital rested under a sky full of stars. Inside, the king remained awake, carrying the quiet burden that came with power. Tomorrow would be another day of rulings, rituals, and decisions. But for now, he held the kingdom in stillness.
The strength of the Shang kingdom didn't come from chariots or bronze alone. It came from the fields, wide stretches of millet, wheat and barley that fed the people and fueled the dynasty's rise. Before the sun touched the horizon, farmers stepped out into the cool morning air, their breath drifting like pale mist. Dew clung to the leaves, birds called from distant trees. The land felt quiet, almost shy, waiting for human hands to wake it. Farming wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, patient, and essential. Every grain grown in those fields supported a soldier, a craftsman, a scribe, or a priest. The kingdom moved because these early risers bent their backs to the soil. As they walked between the rows, wooden tools over their shoulders, the future of the Shang grew with each step. Dynasties weren't built in palaces, they were built here, in the dirt. The Shang weren't just hard-working farmers, they were clever innovators. They developed irrigation channels to guide river water into fields, transforming dry soil into rich farmland. Workers dug long trenches using simple wooden and bone tools, forming networks that wove across the plains like careful handwriting. On hot days, the water shimmered through the channels, reflecting the sky in thin silver lines. These systems didn't appear overnight. They were shaped through trial and error, through seasons of watching water flow and learning how the land responded. Over time, the Shang grew skilled at controlling floods, storing water, and nourishing their crops even during difficult months. This ability to tame the land and to listen to it was one reason their kingdom grew strong. Nature wasn't the enemy, it was a partner. Farming in the Shang world was a community effort. Families worked side by side, helping one another during planting and harvest seasons. Children gathered fallen stalks while elders supervised with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many seasons rise and fall. Even animals played their part. Oxen pulled wooden plows, goats grazed along the edges to keep weeds down, and dogs kept watch over storage pits. The rhythm of life followed the rhythm of the land. When rains came, people smiled with relief. When storms threatened, they prepared together. When harvests were good, the whole village celebrated with meals, music and laughter. And when harvests were poor, they faced the hardship as one. Agriculture wasn't just work, it was a shared heartbeat, the thing that connected every member of the Shang kingdom no matter where they lived. Storage was just as important as farming. After harvest season, families and workers gathered around deep pits lined with packed earth, straw and clay. These underground granaries kept grain cool, dry and safe from pests. People lowered baskets carefully into the pits, pouring golden millet inside until the air smelled sweet and warm. Children peered over the edges, fascinated by the growing piles, while elders reminded everyone to seal the openings tightly. One small mistake could ruin a whole season's work. Some pits belonged to individual families, others were managed by the community or by palace officials who monitored food reserves for the entire city. These storage systems were the backbone of Shang's survival. When winter came, when storms tore through fields, or when enemy forces blocked trade routes, these quiet pits of grain kept the kingdom strong. It wasn't dramatic, but it was life. As the Shang kingdom grew, farming techniques evolved. People experimented with crop rotation, learning which plants refreshed the soil and which ones drained it. They built fences to protect crops from wandering animals and created raised pathways so workers could move through fields without trampling young shoots. Observant farmers studied the behavior of insects, some harmful, some helpful, and adjusted their practices accordingly. Even the timing of planting became more precise as they tracked seasonal shifts and celestial patterns. These improvements didn't appear suddenly, they developed slowly, from years of watching, testing, failing, and trying again. In these small acts of learning, the Shang discovered something powerful. Innovation didn't always come from palaces or priests. Sometimes it came from a lone farmer standing knee-deep in mud, staring thoughtfully at a crop. Animals played a central role in Shang agriculture. Oxen pulled plows through thick earth, their heavy breaths rising like steam in morning air. Pigs rooted around storage areas, eating scraps and helping reduce waste. Chickens strutted across courtyards, supplying eggs and a constant background chorus of clucks. Dogs guarded granaries from theft or wild animals. And horses, though more often used in chariots, sometimes assisted with hauling loads between distant fields. Each creature had a purpose, a place within the rhythm of farming life. Families cared for them not just as tools but as partners. Children learned early how to feed them, how to read their moods, how to guide them gently without force. In many ways, the success of Shang agriculture depended as much on these animals as it did on the farmers themselves. Together they formed a living machine that kept the kingdom moving. Every season brought its own set of challenges, and with those challenges came new innovations. During rainy months, farmers built small raised platforms so tools and seed baskets wouldn't rot in the mud. In dry seasons they dug deeper channels, guiding precious water to thirsty crops with surprising precision. When winds threatened young plants, families worked together to set up temporary barriers made from reeds and woven branches. And when pests arrived, locusts, beetles, stubborn worms, the community acted as one, beating drums or waving cloth to drive the insects away. These weren't grand inventions written in court records. They were simple, clever solutions born from necessity and shared wisdom. Each small adjustment made farming a little easier, a little safer, and slowly the land responded. Fields grew stronger, harvests grew larger, and the people began to trust that hard work and observation could overcome even the most unpredictable seasons. But perhaps the greatest strength of Shang agriculture came from shared knowledge. No farmer worked alone in spirit. Techniques, warnings, and insights passed easily from one family to another, carried in the same way stories were shared around evening fires. An elder might trace a planting pattern in the dirt with a stick, teaching younger farmers when to sow certain seeds. A mother might show her son how to test soil by its color and feel. A grandfather might explain how the stars revealed the coming of seasonal rains. This quiet education built a culture of cooperation and resilience. When one field failed, the community helped replant it. When another succeeded, everyone learned why. The land became a teacher, and the people became its students, generation after generation. This continuous exchange of knowledge gave the Shang kingdom stability that couldn't be broken by a single storm or a single failed harvest. As harvest season approached each year, the Shang world shifted into a kind of excited urgency. Families rose earlier than usual, stepping into golden fields that shimmered in the sunlight. The air felt warm, full of promise.
Workers moved with practiced speed, cutting, gathering, bundling. Laughter echoed between rows of ripened millet, mixed with the steady rhythm of tools brushing through stalks. Even children played their part, carrying smaller bundles or shooing animals away from storage pits. At the end of each long day, baskets overflowed, and the smell of fresh grain hung in the air like a warm blanket. These moments carried a sense of celebration, even before the actual festivals began. The harvest wasn't just food, it was proof of resilience, proof of wisdom, proof that the community and the land were still in harmony. For the Shang, a good harvest was a blessing you could see, touch, and taste. When the harvest was finally complete, the Shang people celebrated with gratitude. Villagers prepared feasts using the season's freshest grain, cooking thick porridges and roasted dishes that filled homes with comforting aromas. Musicians gathered, drums, flutes, and bronze bells ringing into the night. Families lit lanterns, their warm light dancing across walls and courtyards. People thanked the ancestors for guidance, the land for generosity, and each other for hard work. These celebrations were simple, but deeply meaningful. They reminded everyone that the strength of the Shang kingdom didn't grow from war or wealth, it grew from community, innovation, and the steady labor of countless hands. As the night stretched on and the music faded into soft murmurs, villagers looked over their fields with full hearts. Tomorrow, life would return to its regular rhythm, but tonight, the kingdom glowed with a quiet pride only a good harvest could bring.
Before a single ritual could begin, the bronze vessels had to be prepared, and these were not ordinary containers. They were heavy, beautifully carved pieces of art, created through long hours of work in the foundries. Each vessel carried a purpose, holding wine, preserving grain, honoring ancestors, or receiving offerings during ceremonies. When you approached them, you felt their presence immediately. Patterns of spirals, beasts, and mysterious shapes wrapped around their surfaces like whispers from another world. The air around the vessels seemed to hold a quiet weight, as if the ancestors watched through every line carved into the bronze. Workers polished the vessels with slow, careful motions, making the metal glow softly under morning light. It wasn't just cleaning, it was an act of respect, preparing the tools that would carry the voices of the living to the dead. The artistry behind these vessels was unmatched. In small workshops near the palace, master craftsmen created detailed clay molds, carving them with precision and patience. Every line had meaning, every curve carried symbolism older than memory. Some designs represented mythical creatures who guarded the boundary between the living and the spirit world. Others symbolized strength, protection, or the cycle of seasons. Once the mold was ready, molten bronze was poured inside with steady hands. The metal hissed and steamed as it cooled, forming shapes that would last for centuries. When the mold was broken open at last, the finished vessel emerged, dark, heavy, and filled with the quiet dignity of something meant to outlive its creators. These objects weren't just tools, they were messages, artifacts of faith, bridges between worlds. When the time for ceremony arrived, the vessels took center stage. Priests carried them into the ritual courtyard, their steps deliberate and slow. The courtyard itself felt almost sacred, with banners fluttering gently overhead and incense already swirling through the air. The vessels were placed on raised platforms, arranged by size and purpose, like carefully tuned instruments waiting to play their part. The sound of bronze touching stone echoed softly, a deep ringing tone that seemed to settle into the bones of anyone nearby. Ordinary citizens watched from just outside the ritual zone, hoping for a glimpse of the ceremony that guided their kingdom's most important decisions. They knew these vessels weren't there for decoration, they were the heart of the communication between the living and their ancestors. Every placement, every angle, every movement mattered. Once the vessels were arranged, attendants filled them with offerings, wine brewed from millet, fresh grain, slices of meat, or fragrant herbs depending on the ritual's purpose. Each offering was chosen with care. Nothing was rushed, nothing was random. The Shang believed the ancestors tasted these gifts not with their mouths, but through the spirit of the ritual itself. As attendants poured the wine, the scent drifted upward, blending with the smoke of burning incense. The courtyard filled with a warm, earthy aroma. Priests whispered prayers under their breath, touching each vessel lightly, as if greeting an old friend. Even the king paused before approaching, letting the atmosphere settle around him. In these moments, time seemed to stretch, as though the world held its breath. The vessels were no longer just bronze, they were open doors between the human world and the world beyond. When the ritual began, the courtyard filled with sound, not loud music, but slow, steady rhythms, drums tapping softly, bronze bells chiming in gentle waves, the rustle of silk robes brushing against the ground. The king stepped forward, raising a ladle carved from bone or jade, and poured the first offering with a calm hand. Priests followed in practice sequence, each movement repeating the traditions of ancestors long past. Flame from the altar flickered in the wind, casting shifting patterns of gold across the vessel surfaces. These rituals were not meant to impress, they were meant to connect. Every step formed a path stretching backward through time. People watching from outside the courtyard often fell silent, struck by the sense that something ancient and invisible was moving through the air, a whisper of the past, a reminder of continuity. As the ceremony deepened, the vessels themselves became symbols of transformation. Heat from the altar flames warmed their surfaces, making patterns shimmer as if alive. Priests circled them slowly, chanting in tones meant to carry upward, long rising notes that felt both haunting and comforting. Some vessels held wine meant for cleansing, others held food meant for blessing, a few rare ones held inscriptions that guided the diviners who would later crack bones for omens. Together, they formed a complete language of devotion. Ordinary citizens might not know the meaning behind every symbol carved into the bronze, but they understood the feeling, a deep connection to ancestors, to tradition, to a world older than any single lifetime. In these moments, the vessels did not just stand in the courtyard, they glowed with purpose. Some of the most mysterious aspects of the bronze vessels were the designs carved into them. Scholars today still debate their meanings. Twisting shapes of animals, swirling lines, sharp patterns that looked like eyes watching from the metal, all of them carried symbolism, understood by the Shang, but half forgotten by time. During ceremonies, the carvings seemed almost alive in the shifting firelight. The Taoti mask, with its wide staring eyes and curled horns, appeared on many vessels. To the Shang, this wasn't meant to frighten people. It was meant to guard the ritual, to stand as a spiritual gatekeeper that kept harmful forces away. Other vessels carried symbols of dragons, birds, and mythical beasts, said to guide the spirits or represent cosmic balance. When citizens glimpsed these designs from outside the ritual courtyard, they felt a quiet shiver, one of respect, not fear. These patterns were reminders that the world was larger than what eyes could see. During the height of the ritual, the vessels acted almost like instruments. As attendants lifted or set them down, the bronze created deep, ringing tones that floated through the courtyard. The sound was rich and steady, like the heartbeat of the ceremony itself. Priests believed this ringing helped carry prayers upward, giving the ancestors something to follow through the space between worlds. The king listened carefully to every echo, letting the rhythm guide his movements. Citizens outside the ritual walls often paused in their work whenever they heard those tones drifting through the capital. Even from far away, the sound felt meaningful, like a reminder that the kingdom was being watched over. In those moments, the vessel wasn't just an object of metal, it became a voice, a bridge, a messenger carved from earth and shaped by fire. After the main ritual ended, the vessels remained in the courtyard for a time, glowing softly in the fading firelight. Attendants walked among them, checking each one carefully, removing ashes, pouring out remaining wine and wiping the bronze with cloths dipped in warm water. It was slow, gentle work. Priests continued chanting in the background, offering final words of gratitude to the ancestors. The courtyard felt different now, calmer, as if the connection between worlds had begun to close. Even the air seemed to exhale, the tension of the ceremony drifting away. Outside the walls, people returned to their daily tasks, knowing that the kingdom had once again fulfilled its duty. These quiet after-ritual moments were just as important as the ceremony itself. They symbolized respect for the ancestors, for the tools of worship, and for the cycle that guided every Shang life from birth to death. When the vessels were finally returned to their storage halls, the rituals of the day settled into memory. These halls were cool and quiet, lined with shelves of heavy bronze containers resting like sleeping guardians. The king sometimes visited this space alone, walking slowly between the rows. Here, away from the noise of the palace and the pressure of court, he could reflect on the ancestors' guidance. The vessels, now motionless and silent, felt like echoes of distant voices, voices that shaped the kingdom's laws, battles, harvests, and hopes. As the king touched the smooth surface of a vessel, or traced a carved pattern with his fingertips, he was reminded that his power was borrowed, not owned. It flowed from the past, through him, and into the future. Leaving the hall, he stepped back into the world with steady resolve, knowing the dynasty's strength came not just from warriors or rulers, but from the rituals that bound them all together.
Long before priests lit the first fire or touched the first oracle bone, the air in the divination courtyard felt different from the rest of the capital. Quiet, heavy, expectant. This was the place where the living asked questions of the dead, where kings sought guidance from ancestors who had walked the earth centuries before. The courtyard was simple but sacred, its packed earth ground smoothed flat by generations of footsteps. At dawn, when the first golden light touched the walls, diviners gathered in long robes, their faces calm and steady. They prepared the tools of their craft, shoulder blades from oxen, smooth pieces of turtle shell, bundles of incense, and polished bronze needles for carving questions. Every item carried meaning, every breath felt deliberate. By the time the king arrived, the space already seemed to hum with a quiet spiritual tension, like the ancestors were leaning in, waiting to be called upon. The process began with carving the question. A diviner held the bone or shell gently, turning it in the light to find the perfect spot for inscription. Using a sharp bronze tool, he carved symbols into the surface, simple lines that recorded a king's worry, a hope, or a fear. Would the harvest be good? Would the rains come? Should the army march north or stay home?
The carving itself was slow, almost meditative. Each stroke made a faint scraping sound that echoed through the courtyard. When the message was finished, the bone felt transformed. It no longer looked like a piece of an animal. It looked like a letter, one written not to another person but to the world beyond. Even the king watched the process with respect, knowing his decisions rested on what would come next. With the question carved, the next step felt almost like a moment of magic. Diviners placed the bone above glowing embers, or held heated metal rods against its underside. Slowly, cracks formed along the surface, thin lines that spread in delicate, unpredictable patterns. The sound was faint but sharp, a tiny pop echoing through the courtyard like a whispered answer. Everyone leaned in. The king watched closely, his expression calm but intent. To the untrained eye, the cracks looked random, but to the diviners, they were a language. They studied the shape, the angle, the branching of each line, interpreting what the ancestors were trying to say. Whether the message brought comfort or warning, the atmosphere remained solemn. A cracked bone wasn't just a sign, it was a bridge between worlds. Interpreting the cracks was an art that took years to master. Diviners crouched low, turning the bone slightly in the light to see each line clearly. Some cracks were bold and straight, considered signs of strength or affirmation. Others curled like branches, suggesting caution or hidden obstacles. A few spread in chaotic bursts, the kind that made diviners exchange uneasy glances. While the king watched, the chief diviner spoke softly, explaining what the ancestors' response meant for the kingdom. His voice carried a slow rhythm, as if he were translating a language most people couldn't hear. The king listened with steady concentration, weighing each word. Even though he held ultimate authority, he never brushed aside the message. To the Shang, ignoring the ancestors wasn't just foolish, it was dangerous. The cracks on the bone weren't just lines, they were warnings, blessings and guidance woven into the shape of fate itself. Once the message was interpreted, scribes stepped forward with tools in hand. Their job was to record everything: what question was asked, how the cracks appeared, what the diviners said, and what the king ultimately decided. They carved these details directly onto the bone, turning it into a permanent record of a moment in the dynasty's life. The sound of carving filled the courtyard again, soft and deliberate. In time, these inscribed bones would be stored in archives, sometimes buried, sometimes preserved in wooden boxes. No one at the time realized the significance of this act. They were simply keeping track of rituals. But centuries later, these bones would become the earliest known form of Chinese writing. Each carved symbol was a whisper from the past, a message meant for ancestors but rediscovered by scholars thousands of years later. After the reading and recording were complete, the divination ritual entered its quietest stage. The bone, now cracked, carved and interpreted, was placed on a small altar. Priests lit fresh incense and offered a final bow, thanking the ancestors for their guidance. The king made his decision shortly after, whether the question concerned war, weather, harvest, illness, or some mystery troubling the court. Attendants then carried the bone to the storage house, where it rested among hundreds of others. These archives were cool and dark, filled with the faint smell of clay and incense. To the Shang, they were simply storage rooms. But to anyone stepping into that space today, if such a place still existed, it would feel like walking through the thoughts of an entire civilization. Line after line of questions, fears, hopes and answers carved into bone. A library of spirit-filled history. Divination wasn't only for kings. Ordinary families also sought signs from the ancestors, though their rituals were simpler and done at home. A mother worried about her sick child might light a small fire in the courtyard and whisper a prayer into the smoke. A farmer uncertain about the coming rains might study the way shadows fell across his fields at sunset. A daughter choosing a marriage partner might ask her elders to interpret dreams or small coincidences. These everyday acts didn't involve carved bones or official ceremonies, but they carried the same spirit, the belief that the ancestors watched over the living. Even the sound of the palace divination drums carried comfort to households far away. When people heard them echo across the capital, they knew the king was seeking guidance, not just for himself but for everyone who depended on him. For the king, divination was not merely a ritual, it was a burden. There were days when the answers frightened him, cracks that signaled danger, patterns that spoke of drought or unrest, warnings that enemies were gathering, or that illness might strike the royal family. After a troubling reading, the king often retreated to a quiet chamber, sitting alone with the bone in his hands. The weight of leadership felt heavy on nights like these. He was responsible for thousands of lives, yet he had only the whispers of ancestors to guide him. Still, he trusted the ritual, he trusted the voices carried through the cracks. Even when fear stirred in his chest, he breathed slowly and accepted the message. Leadership in the Shang Dynasty meant standing in the space between certainty and mystery and finding courage there. As years passed, the collection of oracle bones grew into an extraordinary archive, shelves filled with thousands of questions, answers, fears, and hopes, all carved into the remains of animals once used for ritual. Scholars today view these bones as priceless artifacts, but in their own time, they were simply records of daily life. Each bone preserved a moment,
a king worrying about the weather, a general asking if victory was likely, a priest seeking clarity on a strange omen. Over time, patterns emerged in the cracks, shaping the decisions that defined the dynasty. Looking back, it is almost haunting to realize that these ancient people, long gone, left behind not just ruins or weapons, but their actual thoughts, written in bone, preserved by fire, whispering across 3,000 years to anyone willing to study them. When a divination ritual finally ended for the night, the courtyard grew still again, the embers cooled, the incense turned to faint grey trails drifting into the dark. The king and his diviners left slowly, their robes brushing the ground in soft whispers. But even after they departed, the place didn't feel empty. It felt watched, gently, quietly by the spirits they had called upon. The vessels, the cracked bones, the markings in the earth all seemed to hold a lingering warmth. To the Shang, this wasn't eerie, it was comforting. It reminded them that they lived in a world connected by unseen threads, that the ancestors never truly left, and that guidance was always close if one listened with respect. As the stars brightened overhead, the courtyard returned to silence, but the messages carved earlier remained, shining softly in the dark, waiting for history to remember them.
The power of the Shang kingdom did not rest on ceremonies alone. Beyond the palace walls, beyond the quiet rituals and carved bones, stood a force that shaped the dynasty's destiny: the military. At dawn, the training grounds came alive with motion. Warriors stretched their arms, tightened leather straps, and lifted bronze weapons that glinted in the rising sun. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and the faint metallic scent of sharpened blades. Commanders barked instructions, their voices echoing across the open field. Some soldiers practiced with spears, thrusting forward in steady, controlled bursts. Others trained with the jo, the fearsome dagger axe that could hook, slice, or pierce in a single sweeping motion. Watching them move together felt like watching a living machine. Every step synchronized, every shout perfectly timed. This discipline didn't happen overnight. It was built through years of commitment and the understanding that the kingdom's safety rested on their shoulders. Though infantry formed the backbone of the Shang army, the kingdom's true symbol of power thundered across the training grounds: the war chariots. Sleek wooden frames reinforced with bronze fittings, pulled by two powerful horses, they moved with surprising speed and grace. A chariot carried 3 men, a driver gripping the reins tightly, a warrior armed with a spear or bow, and a third man responsible for shields or additional weapons. Together they formed a small, fast-moving strike team capable of turning the tide of battle. When dozens of chariots rolled at once, the ground trembled beneath their wheels. Dust exploded into the air, cloaking them like a storm. The Shang did not invent the chariot, but they mastered its use with precision, transforming it into a weapon of fear and authority. Watching them circle the training field felt like witnessing thunder made real. Weapons in the Shang military were more than tools, they were a marriage of craftsmanship and warfare. Bronze spears had razor-sharp tips capable of piercing armor. Dagger axes were shaped for both offense and control, letting warriors hook an enemy's shield or slice across their line. Short swords, though less common, offered flexibility in close combat. Armor was simple but effective, leather reinforced with bronze plates, allowing movement while offering protection. The weapons reflected the kingdom's technological power. Bronze melted, poured, shaped, and sharpened until it shone like fire. Young warriors treated their weapons with respect, polishing them daily and whispering small prayers before drills. They believed the spirit of a weapon grew stronger with the devotion of its wielder. Whether or not this was true, one thing was certain: the weapons of the Shang were as much a part of the dynasty's strength as the warriors who carried them. Strategy was at the heart of every Shang military decision. Battles were not rushed into, they were planned with precision, often beginning in the king's court with divination. The ancestors consulted first, warriors second. Once the message was clear, generals studied maps carved into bamboo strips or painted onto stretched hide. They knew the curves of rivers, the slopes of valleys, the hiding places along forest edges. Scouts walked miles ahead of the army, returning with details about enemy movement, food supplies, and terrain. The generals used this information to position their infantry, assign chariot teams, and choose the moment to strike. Sometimes they acted quickly, surprising enemies at dawn. Other times they waited patiently, letting their opponent make the first mistake. To the Shang, victory came not from strength alone, but from understanding the land like a living partner, reading its signs, respecting its dangers, and using its shape to guide every move. Before battle, warriors performed rituals to prepare their spirits. They washed their hands in cold water, tied leather straps tightly around their wrists, and touched the tips of their weapons to the ground in a quiet moment of respect. Priests moved through the ranks carrying bowls of incense, brushing scented smoke over the warriors' armor and faces. The smoke curled upward like soft grey ribbons, meant to calm the heart and sharpen the mind. Sometimes the king himself visited the troops before they marched, offering a few steady words.
He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His presence alone reminded them that they fought not for themselves but for the kingdom, their families, and the ancestors who watched from beyond. Beneath the soft hum of ritual, a quiet determination settled among the soldiers, an understanding that battle demanded more than courage. It demanded unity. When the Shang army finally marched, the ground trembled with purpose. Infantry moved in tight formations, shields held steady, spears angled forward like a field of bronze-tipped grass. Chariots followed behind, wheels creaking softly before bursting into thunder when they picked up speed. Drummers walked alongside the soldiers, beating slow rhythmic patterns that kept everyone's steps aligned. The sound rolled across the land, a heartbeat of war echoing through open plains and forest edges. Villagers watched quietly as the army passed, some offering food or water, others bowing their heads in prayer. There was fear, yes, but also pride. The Shang military was more than a fighting force. It was a symbol of protection, strength and order. Seeing it move as one, hundreds of warriors, dozens of chariots, drums marking time, felt like watching a living wall roll across the earth. When battle finally erupted, it happened fast. The air filled with dust, kicked up by rushing feet and pounding hooves. Chariots surged forward in sweeping arcs, their wheels carving deep lines into the earth. The jolt of impact carried through every bone as warriors thrust spears or pulled back bowstrings, firing arrows into the chaos. Infantry followed, shields locked in disciplined formation. Their bronze blades flashed in the sunlight, the sound of metal striking metal ringing across the field like harsh music. Drums beat steadily in the background, giving soldiers something to hold on to as the world roared around them. Smoke rose from burning brush, voices shouted commands, and for a moment the battlefield felt like a storm, wild, unpredictable, and terrifying. But through that storm the Shang warriors held their lines. They trusted their training, their generals, their weapons, and the ancestors they had honored hours before. Courage wasn't loud, it was steady. As the tide of battle shifted, the chariots played a decisive role. Moving faster than any infantryman could run, they darted through weak points in the enemy line, turning and striking before opponents could regroup. Drivers leaned forward, gripping the reins with fierce concentration, guiding their horses through swirling dust. Warriors on the chariots attacked from elevated positions, giving them reach and speed no foot soldier could match. Each successful strike sent ripples of panic through enemy ranks. Sometimes a single chariot team could turn a dangerous moment into a swift advantage. But charioteering required trust between the warrior, the driver, and the horses. One mistake meant disaster. When a chariot team moved perfectly, though, it felt like watching a single creature made of wood, bronze, muscle, and instinct, a force born from harmony. When the battle finally faded, the land fell into a heavy stillness. The drums quieted, the dust settled, warriors moved slowly through the field, helping the wounded, gathering weapons, and calling out for missing comrades. The adrenaline drained away, leaving exhaustion in its place. Some soldiers sat on overturned shields, staring into the distance with blank, tired eyes. Others offered water to their friends, or whispered quick prayers of thanks. The chariots rolled to a halt, their horses panting and trembling with sweat. Generals walked the field, assessing the outcome, measuring victory, not by glory but by survival. There was no celebration here, only relief, humility, and the understanding that war always came with a price. Even in triumph, the Shang army treated the fallen with respect, offering small rites as the sun dipped low. The battlefield felt quieter than it had any right to be. Back in the capital, the army returned as the sun set behind the hills. Villagers lined the roads, offering water, food, and quiet gratitude. There was pride, yes, but not the loud kind. It was a soft, steady pride, born from knowing the kingdom remained safe for another season. The king met the generals in the palace courtyard, thanking them personally before offering incense to the ancestors. Nearby, soldiers cleaned their weapons, washing away the dust of battle. The rhythmic scraping of bronze felt almost soothing, like a ritual all its own. When night finally settled over the city, small fires glowed in every district as families welcomed home the men who protected them. The Shang military machine wasn't just about strength, it was about unity, an entire society moving together, surviving together, and believing that courage meant standing firm even when the world shook. In that belief, the dynasty found its heartbeat.
Before sunrise, the foundries of the Shang capital were already awake. The air carried a faint metallic smell, mixed with the smoky scent of burning charcoal. As workers stepped into the broad earthen workshops, the world around them glowed with the soft orange light of early morning fires. These men were craftsmen, masters of a trade that blended art, science, and intuition. They weren't warriors or priests, yet they held a quiet power of their own. Their hands shaped the weapons that protected the kingdom and the vessels that spoke to the ancestors. Thick aprons covered their clothes, and soot clung to their skin like a badge of honor. As the furnaces roared to life, sparks leapt into the air, and the workers prepared for another long day of melting, molding, hammering, and creating. Here, in the heat and shadow, the true heartbeat of the Bronze Age pulsed steadily. Casting bronze was a delicate dance. First came the molds, carefully crafted from clay, with patterns carved into their surfaces. Craftsmen worked slowly, etching spirals, animal motifs, and sacred symbols with thin wooden tools. These designs weren't decoration, they were meaning poured into the metal. Once the molds were ready, workers heated copper and tin until the mixture glowed like liquid fire. The furnace roared louder, almost alive. When the bronze reached the perfect temperature, a team of craftsmen worked together to lift the heavy crucible, tilting it toward the mold with steady hands. The molten metal flowed like a glowing river, filling each carved line and empty space. A hush fell across the workshop as the metal cooled. Even the workers paused. In that moment, they weren't just craftsmen, they were creators shaping the future piece by piece. When the bronze cooled, the workshop filled with a different kind of energy, one of anticipation. Craftsmen broke open the clay mold, revealing the new object hidden inside. Sometimes it was a weapon, sometimes a ritual vessel, sometimes a tool for farming or crafting. No matter the purpose, the moment always felt a bit like unwrapping something sacred. The bronze emerged dull at first, coated in bits of clay and ash. Workers cleaned it gently with brushes and cloths, revealing patterns that had been nothing more than lines carved into clay hours earlier. The transformation was magical. A rough object became smooth. A simple design became alive. When the craftsmen held the finished piece up to the light, smiles tugged at the corners of their tired faces. This wasn't just metal, it was proof of their skill, patience, and quiet creativity. Once the bronze pieces emerged from their molds, the work was far from over. Now came the shaping, smoothing, and refining, the part of the craft that demanded patience above all else. Craftsmen sat on low wooden stools, using files, stones, and bronze scrapers to remove imperfections. Each stroke was slow and deliberate, shaving away tiny bits of metal until the surface shone. The rhythmic scraping filled the workshop like a steady heartbeat. Younger apprentices watched closely, learning how much pressure to apply, how to angle the tool, how to feel the metal's response through their fingertips. This stage turned raw bronze into something beautiful. Weapons that gleamed like sunrise, ritual vessels that carried the weight of history, and tools that could last for generations. In these quiet hours, the noise of the forge faded, replaced by the soft conversation between craftsmen and their craft. The workshops weren't just places of labor, they were centers of innovation. As the dynasty grew, craftsmen began experimenting with new shapes and casting methods. Some tried more complex molds, layering clay to create deeper patterns. Others tested different bronze mixtures, adjusting the ratio of copper to tin to make weapons sharper or vessels stronger. The most daring craftsmen studied how heat flowed through the molds, tweaking furnace temperatures to control cooling times. Failures were common, molds cracked, metal cooled unevenly, designs warped. But each mistake taught them something new. Over time, these experiments produced breakthroughs: stronger dagger axes, more durable chariot fittings, more expressive ritual vessels. The foundry wasn't just repeating tradition, it was pushing boundaries, one glowing pour at a time. Teamwork held everything together. No single craftsman controlled the entire process. One shaped the mold, another mixed the metal, a third poured the bronze with careful precision, others cleaned, refined, and inspected each piece. Their movements were coordinated without needing many words. Everyone understood their role. Apprentices ran between workstations carrying tools, water, or clay. Older craftsmen shared quiet advice, guiding younger hands through difficult steps. Even the smallest task felt meaningful, because it contributed to something larger. In this world of fire and metal, age didn't matter as much as skill, patience, and trust. The foundry wasn't just a workplace, it was a community, bound together by heat, sweat, and the shared belief that their craft helped hold the kingdom together. Among all the craftsmen, the mold carvers were the closest thing the Shang had to artists. Their hands shaped the creatures and symbols that later glowed on ritual vessels. These carvers worked in a quieter corner of the workshop, away from the heat of the furnaces. Clay slabs rested before them like blank pages waiting for a story. With thin wooden tools they etched swirling spirals, curling horns, sharp eyes, and layered patterns meant to honor the ancestors or guard the spirit world. The famous Coyote face, half beast, half mystery, emerged slowly under their touch. Each stroke mattered. One wrong curve could distort the entire design. As apprentices watched in awe, the carvers whispered explanations. This line represents protection, or this shape connects the living to the ancestors. For them, the work wasn't decoration, it was language. Finished bronze pieces didn't stay in the workshop long. Once polished and inspected, they were carried through the capital to their final homes, palaces, temples, armories, or private family altars. The journey felt almost ceremonial. Workers wrapped the vessels or weapons in cloth to protect them, walking carefully along busy streets. Citizens stepped aside respectfully, knowing that each bronze piece carried importance. A dagger axe might one day defend the kingdom, a vessel might hold offerings in the next great ritual. Even simple tools, shaped by the same fires and hands, helped farmers grow crops or helped builders raise new homes. In this way, the craftsmen reached every corner of the Shang world,
Their creations lived many lives, some in battle, some in prayer, some in everyday tasks, and though the craftsmen remained mostly unseen, their work became a quiet, steady force behind the dynasty's rise. When the day finally ended and the furnaces cooled, the foundry shifted into a rare moment of calm. Workers sat on overturned crates or leaned against warm clay walls, wiping soot from their arms and faces. The glow of dying embers cast soft red light across the workshop, reflecting off half-finished molds and tools scattered around the floor. In these quiet minutes, craftsmen often admired the pieces they had completed, holding them gently, tilting them toward the light, nodding in quiet satisfaction. Their work was exhausting, dangerous, and often overlooked, but they knew its value. They knew that the kingdom's warriors fought with weapons forged by their hands, that priests prayed with vessels they shaped, and that the dynasty's legacy flowed through their fires day after day. In that soft glow, surrounded by the tools of their trade, they allowed themselves a moment of pride. As night settled fully over the capital, the foundry doors were closed and the fires left to rest, but the work done inside never truly stopped. Every mold, every spark, every polished blade contributed to a larger story, the rise of a kingdom built not only by kings and warriors, but by ordinary hands capable of extraordinary skill. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover Shang bronzes and marvel at their artistry, wondering how such intricate designs were created so early in history. They would study the metals, the patterns, the casting methods, and still be left with admiration. The craftsmen of the Shang didn't work for fame, they worked because the kingdom needed them, and because fire, metal, and clay had become part of who they were. Their legacy lived on, not just in museums, but in every shimmering vessel and every perfectly balanced weapon dug from the earth.
Long before the sun rose over the Shang capital, traders were already preparing for the day's journey. Carts creaked under the weight of pottery, grain, animal skins, and small bronze tools wrapped carefully in cloth. Horses snorted softly, stamping their hooves in the cool morning air. A thin mist hovered over the dusty roads, blurring the horizon into a soft grey line. These roads stretched far beyond the capital, across villages, through forests and along winding riverbanks. This network of paths and waterways formed the kingdom's veins, carrying goods, news, and ideas from place to place. Travel wasn't easy, roads were rough, weather unpredictable, but traders pushed forward because the kingdom relied on movement. Without these early risers, the Shang would be a collection of isolated villages. With them, it became a living, connected world. Rivers were highways of the ancient world, and the Shang understood that well. Long wooden boats glided along wide, muddy waters, carrying everything from bundles of grain to baskets of jade and shells. Oars cut through the river with smooth, steady strokes, leaving ripples that shimmered in the light. Boatmen called warnings to one another as they navigated currents and sandbars. Along the banks, farmers paused to watch the boats pass, waving from the fields. River travel connected distant settlements, allowing goods to flow faster than carts could travel on land. But it also carried stories, tales of new villages, strange customs, or faraway storms. Every journey added a little more knowledge to the Shang world. In this way, the rivers were not just water, they were memory. The marketplaces where traders gathered were vibrant, noisy, and full of life. Stalls made from wood and woven mats lined the square, offering pottery with swirling patterns, bundles of herbs, jade ornaments, woven baskets, dried fish, and handmade bronze tools. People bartered with expressive gestures, pointing, nodding, shaking their heads, and laughing when a deal was finally reached. Travelers from different regions brought unfamiliar accents and clothing styles, turning the marketplace into a small world of cultural exchange. Children weaved between the stalls, chasing chickens or sneaking glances at shiny bronze trinkets. In the center of it all, storytellers shared news from distant places: a flood in the north, a new settlement in the east, a caravan attacked by bandits. Markets were more than commercial spaces, they were hubs of information, imagination, and connection. Trade didn't flow in one direction. As Shang traders traveled outward, they brought their own goods to distant settlements: millet, finely crafted bronze tools, ceremonial vessels, and polished jade pieces that gleamed like frozen moonlight. In return, they received items not easily found in the capital: rare stones, feathers from distant birds, shells from far-off coasts, medicinal herbs, and stories carried from places beyond the kingdom's borders. Every exchange deepened relationships between communities. Some villages greeted Shang traders like old friends, offering meals and stories before any bargaining began. Others watched cautiously at first, unsure of outsiders, but over time trust was built, deal by deal, smile by smile. As goods moved along these routes, so did ideas, new farming methods, new songs, new myths. The world grew just a little bigger with each journey. Messengers played a crucial role in keeping the kingdom connected. These were not traders but swift runners and skilled riders trusted to carry messages across long distances. They traveled light,
Just a small bag, a water skin, and the message itself, sealed with a carved token from the court. Some routes took them through thick forests where shadows moved in strange ways, others followed rocky paths along river cliffs where footing was dangerous, but messengers pressed on, guided by memory and instinct. When they reached their destination, they presented the message with deep respect, knowing that a single piece of news could change a village's plans, a general's orders, or a king's next move. Their journeys were quiet, often lonely, but essential. Without them, the Shang world would fall out of sync, each region drifting silently away from the others. Travel also brought risk. Bandits occasionally lurked along isolated roads, eyeing carts loaded with goods. Sudden storms washed out paths or turned gentle rivers into raging floods. Wild animals wandered dangerously close to trade routes. To stay safe, traders often traveled in groups, forming caravans where each person watched over the others. Some caravans brought armed escorts, warriors with spears and sharp bronze blades glinting under the sun. Camps at night were arranged in tight circles, with fires burning in the center and lookouts keeping watch. Yet despite the dangers, people continued to travel. They knew that movement meant survival. Stagnant villages fell behind, but connected villages thrived. Trade was not just economy, it was courage, cooperation, and the shared belief that the world was worth exploring. With every journey, the Shang people encountered customs and traditions different from their own. Some villages played unfamiliar instruments, hollow wooden flutes with soft wavering tones. Others told creation myths about sky dragons, river spirits, or animal ancestors unfamiliar to the Shang storytellers. These ideas often traveled back to the capital, weaving into local beliefs like threads added to a growing tapestry. In return, Shang rituals, artwork, and bronze work spread outward, influencing communities across the region. A potter in a distant village might begin carving spirals inspired by Shang vessels. A small clan might adopt Shang-style ancestor rituals after seeing them performed. Cultural exchange didn't feel dramatic while it was happening. It grew slowly, quietly through shared meals, traded stories, and late-night conversations by riverbanks. In time, it helped shape a world more connected than anyone realized. Trade also introduced new materials and technologies to the Shang. From distant regions came stones not found near the capital, turquoise, agate, and deep green jade, with streaks like lightning trapped inside. These materials inspired new art forms and expanded what craftsmen could create. Traders returned with unusual seeds that farmers tested in small plots, watching how they grew in Shang soil. They brought textiles woven with unfamiliar patterns, tools shaped differently from those at home, and even distant cooking methods that slowly influenced Shang kitchens. Each item carried a story of where it came from. Craftsmen studied the foreign pieces carefully, sometimes copying techniques, other times improving upon them. Through these exchanges, innovation traveled far beyond the workshops. It reached the fields, the homes, and even the court. The Shang Dynasty didn't evolve in isolation, it grew stronger by learning. As decades passed, the constant movement of people, goods, and ideas began to reshape the kingdom's identity. Markets grew larger, roads became smoother from years of footsteps and cartwheels. River routes became familiar, almost like old friends guiding travelers through the landscape. Songs from distant regions were sung in the capital. Pottery styles blended, mixing local techniques with foreign inspiration. Even languages shifted slightly, adopting new words that slipped naturally into conversation. None of this happened by decree, it happened by connection, by thousands of small choices made by ordinary people. A trader buying a foreign charm because it reminded him of a story he heard, a farmer planting a new seed, a craftsman trying a new carving style. Through these invisible threads, the Shang world expanded beyond its borders. It became a culture shaped not just by what it produced, but by what it welcomed. At the end of each long journey, traders returned to the capital, tired but fulfilled. Their clothes smelled of river wind and campfire smoke. Their carts rattled with new goods, and stories gathered mile by mile. Families greeted them with open arms, eager to hear what lay beyond the horizon. Even the king benefited from these journeys. News of distant lands helped shape diplomatic decisions, military strategies, and ritual practices. Travel connected the Shang people, not only to each other, but to the wider world. And as the sun set over the capital, casting long golden light across roads worn smooth by decades of footsteps, it became clear that trade was more than economy, it was memory, courage, adventure, and understanding. Through these paths and rivers, the Shang Dynasty breathed in the world and exhaled its own unique identity.
In the Shang kingdom, the spiritual world felt as close as the air people breathed. Every home, every field, every ritual space existed under the watchful presence of ancestors and unseen forces. The Shang believed the world was layered, humans in one realm, spirits in another, and somewhere between them stood the king, acting as a bridge. At dawn, as the first light brushed over rooftops and fields, families lit small sticks of incense, letting the smoke rise into the sky. They whispered names of loved ones who had passed on, trusting that these spirits still cared, still listened, still guided the living. Even the wind felt meaningful. A sudden gust might be a sign. A calm breeze might be a blessing. For the Shang people, the world was alive with messages. Central to Shang belief was the idea of ancestor worship. In every household, small altars displayed carved bones, bits of jade, and bowls for offerings. During important festivals, families placed food, wine, and symbolic gifts on these altars, inviting their ancestors to join them. To outsiders, it might have looked like simple tradition, but to the Shang, these acts were a lifeline. They believed ancestors held great influence over weather, health, prosperity, and safety. A good harvest wasn't just luck, it was a sign the ancestors were pleased. A difficult storm meant something had been forgotten or neglected. Rituals were the way to restore balance, to open a door between the living and the dead. Even children understood this, watching their parents bow deeply and feeling the weight of those moments settle into their hearts. Beyond the ancestors stood powerful nature spirits, the forces believed to control rain, rivers, storms, mountains, and the fertile earth. Farmers prayed to river spirits before planting, hoping for steady water flow but not floods. Hunters asked mountain spirits for safety before venturing into deep forests. Even warriors appealed to sky spirits for strength before battle. These beliefs weren't abstract. They arose from daily life, from the unpredictable beauty and danger of the natural world. When thunder rolled across the plains, some Shang villagers imagined a mighty spirit speaking. When river waters shimmered strangely at dusk, they wondered if a guardian watched from beneath the surface. Life felt full of presence. Every sound, every shadow, every change in the air carried meaning. Rituals were the heartbeat of Shang religious life. Whether performed in a grand temple or a small village courtyard, they followed patterns passed down for generations. Fires were lit first, their crackling warmth meant to welcome the spirits. Then came the offerings, grains, wine, polished jade or bronze vessels filled with fragrant steam. Musicians played slow, steady rhythms on drums and bone flutes, their sounds rising into the night like a call across worlds. Priests led the rituals with calm precision, moving their hands in practiced motions as they chanted for guidance, protection, or forgiveness. People gathered quietly behind them, watching the flames dance and feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon them. To the Shang, these ceremonies were not optional. They were essential, a way to stay in harmony with the forces that shaped their lives. One of the most sacred symbols in Shang religion was the dragon, a creature of power, transformation, and mystery. Unlike later Chinese dragons known for their long, elegant bodies, early Shang dragons appeared in many shapes. Some were snake-like with curling tails, others looked fierce and sharp with wide jaws and spiraled horns. To the Shang, dragons weren't monsters, they were guardians. They appeared on jade ornaments, bronze vessels, pottery, and even bone carvings. People believed dragons lived in rivers and clouds, guiding storms and carrying messages between the heavens and the earth. When rain finally arrived after a long drought, villagers sometimes said, "The dragon has remembered us." These beliefs gave comfort in a world where weather could bring life or disaster at any moment. As the highest authority, he was believed to communicate directly with the ancestors, especially the mighty ancestral kings who came before him. His rituals were more elaborate, more sacred, and often more intense. In great temple courtyards, he knelt before towering altars while priests arranged offerings around him. The air shimmered with heat from braziers burning bright. Every movement was witnessed by advisors, warriors, scribes, and, symbolically, by the spirits themselves. When the king prayed for rain, for victory, or for the health of the kingdom, he did so on behalf of all the Shang people. His successes were seen as proof that the ancestors favored him. His failures were warnings that something in the balance had shifted. To be king meant carrying not just political power, but spiritual weight. Myths traveled through the Shang world like drifting smoke, soft, shifting, and full of meaning. Around fire pits at night, elders shared stories of powerful spirits who shaped the land. One tale spoke of a river spirit with glowing eyes, who guarded the deepest currents. Another told of a mountain god who could move entire cliffs to protect lost travelers. There were stories of wind spirits that whispered secrets to farmers, or shadowy creatures who slipped between trees at dusk, watching but never approaching. These myths were not meant to frighten, they were meant to explain the strange things people observed every day. A sudden change in the river's path, an echo that didn't match a footstep, a storm that arrived out of nowhere, everything had a story behind it, and in those stories people found comfort, curiosity, and a sense that the world around them was alive. Among the most mysterious spirits in Shang mythology were the ancestral kings, believed to hold immense power even after death. Some stories claimed they could send dreams to guide the living, others said they appeared as shimmering figures in temple courtyards during times of crisis. Priests often described them as tall, radiant beings, whose faces glowed like the moon. The people saw these ancestors not as ghosts, but as guardians watching their descendants grow, struggle, and triumph. Occasionally, villagers would speak of strange moments, hearing a familiar voice in the wind, or feeling a comforting presence during hardship. Whether these experiences were real or imagined didn't matter. What mattered was the sense of connection, the belief that those who built the kingdom still walked beside the living.
In this way, the past never felt distant to the Shang, it felt present. At the heart of Shang spirituality was a constant effort to stay in harmony with the unseen world. People believed that when balance was kept between heaven and earth, between ancestors and the living, life flowed smoothly, harvests were steady, families stayed healthy, storms passed without destruction. But when that balance slipped, the world felt different. Crops wilted earlier, animals behaved strangely, or winds carried a restless chill. In response, the Shang performed rituals to restore peace. Priests lit fresh incense, families offered new bowls of food at their altars, the king consulted the oracle bones. These acts, simple and grand alike, reflected a shared belief that humans were not alone in shaping fate. The world was a partnership between the living and the spirits, a relationship that needed care, devotion, and respect. The fires in homes dimmed to soft orange glows, and the temple drums ceased their slow rhythms. But even in the stillness, people felt the presence of the spiritual world around them. Some families placed one last offering of wine or fruit on their altars before sleeping. Others sat outside their homes, watching the stars and whispering stories passed down from their elders. In the distance, the grand temples stood like silent guardians, their rooftops reflecting faint moonlight. The Shang world never truly slept. It breathed with the living and the dead, with gods and ancestors, with myth and memory. In that shared darkness, people found comfort, a sense that they belonged to something ancient, something vast, something that held their world together. Faith was not just belief, it was identity.
At sunrise, the Shang capital woke slowly, like a giant settling into its morning rhythm. Thin trails of smoke curled upward from cooking fires, carrying the scent of boiling millet and warm broth. Homes built from packed earth and timber stood close together, their walls brushed with soft morning light. Roosters crowed in distant courtyards, dogs trotted across narrow paths, and children, always the first to wake, peeked out of doorways with curious eyes. The city felt both old and alive, shaped by hundreds of families going about their routines. As people stepped outside, greeting neighbors with nods or sleepy smiles, the capital began to hum with the soft energy of another ordinary day. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand, just life steady, warm and familiar. Most Shang homes were simple but thoughtfully arranged. A central hearth provided warmth and a space for cooking, with clay pots stacked neatly along the wall. Low stools surrounded woven mats where families ate their meals. Tools hung from wooden pegs, bronze knives, bone needles, farming implements polished smooth from years of use. In one corner, a small ancestor altar stood with bowls of dried grain or fruit, reminding everyone that even in daily routine, the past was never far away. Outside, courtyards bustled with activity. Women washed clothes in wooden tubs or ground millet on stone slabs. Children chased one another around clay pots, laughing loudly until someone reminded them to be careful. Everything in a Shang home had purpose, but nothing felt harsh. Life moved at a pace that made room for work, rest, and connection. As the morning brightened, the streets filled with people headed toward the marketplace. Farmers carried baskets of vegetables, craftsmen brought pottery, bronze tools, or woven mats. Traders pushed small carts loaded with goods wrapped in cloth. The streets echoed with friendly chatter as neighbors exchanged updates: who fixed their roof, whose child learned a new song, which family expected visitors from another village. The air buzzed with social life. Chickens darted between feet, dogs lounged lazily in sunny patches. Totem poles carved with animal motifs marked neighborhood boundaries, giving each district its own identity and pride. The Shang capital wasn't a silent, rigid place. It was warm and energetic, built from countless small interactions that tied people together. By mid-morning, the marketplace burst into full color and sound. Vendors called out their prices, waving bundles of fresh vegetables or lifting polished bronze tools to catch the sunlight. Potters displayed rows of clay cups, bowls, and storage jars decorated with swirling patterns. Fishermen laid out their morning catch on woven mats, the air carrying a salty, familiar smell. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, pointing excitedly at vendors selling sweetened millet cakes. Music drifted from a corner where a small group of performers played bone flutes and hand drums, drawing a cheerful crowd. Markets weren't just for buying and selling, they were the social heartbeat of the capital. People came to exchange gossip, share news, make friends, and sometimes argue loudly before laughing it off moments later. Life here moved with warmth and rhythm. Food stalls filled the air with tempting smells. Large clay pots simmered with stews made from millet, greens, and bits of meat. Skewers of roasted fish crackled over small charcoal pits. Street cooks worked with practiced hands, flipping flatbreads, pouring warm broth into bowls, grinding herbs with stone mortars. People sat on low stools to eat, chatting between bites about weather, work, or the latest palace rumors. Some travelers brought recipes from other regions, introducing flavors the locals had never tasted before. A traveler from the coast might offer salted shellfish stew. Someone from the mountains might cook with wild herbs unknown in the capital. The result was a gentle blending of food traditions across the kingdom. A Shang meal was more than sustenance. It was a gathering, a story, a comfort shared under the morning sun. Surrounding the marketplace were workshops where craftsmen shaped the city's daily needs. The rhythmic pounding of stone grinders, the scrape of bronze polishers, and the steady thump of carpenters' mallets filled the air like a working symphony. Bronze workers hammered tools into shape, potters spun clay on simple wheels, rope makers twisted fibers into cords, carpenters carved wooden beams and stools. Apprentices hurried between workstations carrying buckets of water, bundles of reeds, or newly finished goods. These workshops were the backbone of urban life, supplying homes, farms, temples, and the palace itself. Each craft had its own traditions, passed from master to student, and within these walls friendships formed, skills grew, and generations of knowledge were preserved in the rhythm of everyday work. Afternoons in the Shang capital carried a softer tone. Once the busiest market hours passed, people found small pockets of time to relax. In open courtyards, elderly neighbors gathered beneath shaded trees, playing simple board games carved from bone and wood. Their laughter rose and fell like music as they teased one another over bold moves or foolish mistakes. Children darted between houses, chasing each other with the kind of boundless energy adults could only dream of. Some practiced with tiny wooden spears, pretending to be mighty warriors. Others played games with pebbles, inventing rules as they went. Teenagers sat in clusters, weaving baskets or braiding cords while trading stories about crushes, chores, and dreams for the future. Even in a city ruled by kings and rituals, these ordinary moments gave life its warmth. Learning took place everywhere in the capital. Young apprentices followed their masters closely, memorizing each gesture, how to shape clay, carve wood, grind herbs, or polish bronze. Some families taught their children songs that preserved stories of ancestors and local heroes. Others practiced simple writing by copying scratched characters onto pieces of bone or wood. In the palace district, the education was more formal. Young nobles learned etiquette, history, music, and the basics of divination. Their lessons were demanding but filled with meaning, preparing them for leadership roles. And in the quieter homes, parents taught their children how to behave toward elders, how to make offerings correctly, how to farm wisely, and how to treat neighbors with respect. Every path, whether humble or noble, was part of the shared fabric of Shang society. As evening settled over the capital, the city softened into a warm, inviting glow. Cooking fires flickered to life one home after another, sending fragrant smoke drifting through the streets. Families gathered around their hearths for dinner, bowls of millet porridge, roasted vegetables, fish cooked with herbs, or leftover stew reheated from the morning. People talked about their day, who sold well in the market, whose roof needed repair, which neighbor's child had learned a new song. Outside, some families ate in their courtyards, enjoying the cool night breeze. Lanterns hung from wooden posts cast gentle golden circles onto the ground. Dogs stretched lazily beside doorways, and the laughter of children slowly faded as they were called indoors. The capital felt safe in these moments, held together by food, conversation, and the steady rhythm of ordinary life. As night fully embraced the city, musicians emerged into open spaces, playing flutes, drums, and stringed instruments that echoed softly between homes. Neighbors gathered to listen, swaying gently or tapping their feet. Children curled up beside their parents, fighting sleep as they watched the flames dance in nearby braziers. Some people used this time for quiet prayer at their family altars, offering a final bowl of water or grain before bed. Others stepped outside to gaze at the stars, wondering what stories the ancestors might whisper down from the sky. The palace district glowed faintly in the distance, its tall buildings silhouetted against the moon, and in every neighborhood, the same warm feeling settled over the capital, a sense that life, simple, steady, and shared, was something precious. Under the starlit sky, the Shang world felt whole.
The final years of the Shang Dynasty began quietly, so quietly in fact, that few people living at the time realized they were standing in the shadow of great change. The capital still bustled each morning, markets still filled with chatter, ritual fires still rose into the air, carrying prayers to the ancestors. On the surface, life looked steady, but beneath that calm, small cracks were forming. Crops failed more often than before, strange weather patterns unsettled farmers, border tribes grew bolder, testing the kingdom's defenses, and whispers of dissatisfaction drifted through distant villages, carried by traders and travelers. These early signs didn't yet feel like disaster. They felt like an unease, a slow tightening in the air, as if the spirits themselves were holding their breath. Much of the unrest centered around the Shang king himself. While earlier kings had been respected for their wisdom and devotion to ritual, the last Shang ruler, King Zhou Xin, was known for excess. Rumors spread that he cared more about lavish feasts and grand entertainment than the needs of his people. Some stories claimed he built opulent halls decorated with precious stones while villages struggled to feed themselves. Others whispered that he ignored the advice of his diviners, believing his power stood above the ancestors' warnings. Whether these tales were exaggerated or not, the result was the same. Trust in the royal court began to fade.
The king still performed rituals, still commanded armies, still held the mandate of heaven in the eyes of his supporters, but cracks in loyalty were spreading. Beyond the Shang heartland, a rising power watched these weaknesses carefully. The Zhou people, living in the western regions, the Zhou had long respected the Shang but had grown stronger year by year. Their leaders fostered unity among neighboring tribes, building alliances that strengthened their position. Their warriors trained with discipline, and their rulers encouraged moral leadership, rooted in fairness and duty. When Zhou envoys visited the Shang capital, they observed everything: the tension in the markets, the fear in the villages, the extravagance of the palace. They returned home with a simple conclusion: the time of the Shang was weakening, and a new dynasty might soon rise. For now, the Zhou waited, but waiting did not mean inactivity, it meant preparation. As difficulties mounted, the Shang people turned more urgently to divination. Oracle bones cracked night after night under the heat of sacred fires. Diviners leaned close, searching for signs, warnings of floods, hints of rebellion, messages urging caution. The bones told troubling stories. They spoke of danger along the borders, of ancestors who seemed restless, of forces beyond the king's control. But the king, increasingly distant from his advisors, dismissed many of these messages. Some said he feared the truth they revealed. Others believed he simply no longer trusted the voices of the past. Whatever the reason, the result was the same: the kingdom drifted without clear guidance. The rituals continued, but the meaning behind them felt hollow. For a civilization built on spiritual balance, this disconnect was a dangerous omen. Farmers complained of heavier taxes, craftsmen struggled as resources became scarce, soldiers whispered about battle, Trenothi king ordered without reason. Small rebellions flared in remote villages, quickly put down but never forgotten. Each uprising left the kingdom more strained, more fractured. Even the capital felt uneasy. Markets remained busy, but conversations carried an edge. Neighbors lowered their voices when discussing politics. Families debated whether the ancestors were sending signs that change was coming. The once stable bond between ruler and people grew thinner with each passing season. Fear and frustration intertwined, creating a tension felt in every corner of the Shang world. While the Shang faltered, the Zhou moved with steady purpose. Their leader, King Wen of Zhou, was known for his fairness and strategic mind. He built alliances with neighboring clans, strengthened trade routes, and encouraged moral leadership. Although still outwardly loyal to the Shang, he quietly prepared for a future where his people might step into a greater role. After King Wen's death, his son King Wu inherited not only the throne but the momentum of a rising nation. Under his leadership, Zhou warriors trained harder, alliances tightened, and plans solidified. To the Zhou, rebellion against the Shang wasn't an act of greed, it was destiny. The mandate of heaven, they believed, had shifted, and soon the world would know it. When the Zhou finally moved against the Shang, they did not march alone. Allied clans from distant valleys, river kingdoms and mountain settlements joined their cause, forming a coalition unlike anything seen before. Long lines of warriors stretched across the landscape, chariots rumbling forward, spearmen marching in disciplined rows, banners snapping in the wind. The air carried the steady beat of war drums guiding their steps. Villagers watched from afar, some hopeful, others fearful, all sensing that a turning point in history had arrived. The Zhou did not advance recklessly. Their movements were calculated, patient and purposeful. Every camp was set with care. Every meeting of generals was filled with strategy. They believed the mandate of heaven was on their side, and with each step toward the Shang capital, that belief grew stronger. The final confrontation would take place at the Battle of Munai, a wide open plain where the Shang army assembled to defend their dynasty. But the Shang troops were not united. Many soldiers marched with heavy feet, burdened by doubts about their king. Some had suffered under high taxes, or seen their villages crumble. Others had heard stories of Zhou fairness and strength, and wondered where heaven's favor truly rested. As both armies faced each other across the field, tension filled the air like a drawn bowstring. Dust swirled around the soldiers' ankles, horses pawed at the ground. And then something remarkable happened. Some Shang soldiers simply lowered their weapons, refusing to fight. Others defected entirely, walking calmly across the field to join the Zhou ranks. The battle had not even begun, yet the outcome was already shifting. When the battle finally erupted, it was brief but decisive. Zhou warriors surged forward with precision, their chariots cutting through the weakened Shang lines. The remaining loyal Shang troops fought fiercely, but confusion rippled through their ranks. Some soldiers resisted the Zhou advance, while others simply turned and fled. The earth shook beneath pounding hooves, and bronze weapons clashed under a rising cloud of dust. Through it all, King Wu of Zhou stood firm, guiding his army with calm authority. The Shang king, isolated and abandoned by many of his own men, retreated to his palace in despair. The mandate of heaven, a belief that rulers held divine approval, had clearly shifted, and as the dust settled over the fields of Muji, the once mighty Shang dynasty collapsed, giving way to a new era. After the battle,
the Zhou entered the Shang capital not as destroyers, but as builders of a new order. King Wu performed solemn rites to honor the fallen and offer peace to the spirits of the Shang ancestors. He did not erase the dynasty's memory, he preserved it. Under his leadership, the Zhou adopted many Shang traditions, including bronze casting, ancestor worship, and the use of oracle symbols. Yet they carried forward a new idea as well. The mandate of heaven could shift from one dynasty to another, depending on the virtue of its rulers. This belief shaped Chinese history for thousands of years. As lanterns flickered in the streets that night, citizens stepped out of their homes with cautious hope. A dynasty had ended, but life, quiet, resilient, and ever-flowing, moved forward. The Shang spirit lived on in their art, their stories, their rituals, and their people, and now, a new chapter had begun.